Our next agenda item was the review and discussion of the veterinary student exemption. We needed to update that language that's in 4830, the exemption language, and in part that was to make it clear under what conditions veterinary students may perform surgery and what level of supervision specifically, and also to try and find a way to recognize and formalize the relationship that off-campus sites that are part of the formal curriculum versus going and hanging out at a clinic for a weekend. This is part of your formal curriculum, how those off-campus sites interact with the campus, and we create the discussion, the dialogue to make sure that there's the quality control and whatnot, that the student is getting the experience that they need, but also that we have the consumer protection piece in place. So that was the discussion. What you have on this page here in bold is the language that was adopted by a 5-4 vote. So it was very close. And the paragraph that is not in bold was the substitute second paragraph. And there are some key differences between them. Maybe I should read them real quick and give you a chance to kind of process. Let us say, I'm going to read 4830A5A, the first paragraph, but there really was no specific controversy over this part of it. Students of an American Veterinary Medical Association Council on Education accredited veterinary medical program may participate as part of their formal curriculum in diagnosis and treatment with direct supervision or in surgery with immediate supervision. The student must have prior training in these activities as part of their formal curriculum, and supervision must be by a California licensed veterinarian in good standing as defined by those paragraphs and subdivisions. The second part talks about the off-campus or distributive sites, and that we would have a formal curriculum in place of on-campus education with the memorandum of understanding between the accredited veterinary program and the off-campus or distributive site, which would provide a written description of the educational objectives to be achieved, an annual review conducted by the accredited veterinary medical program of the site to ensure that the educational program is being delivered in accordance with the MOU, and that a mechanism for assessing the training outcomes of the educational process. In other words, evaluation of the students and those teaching the students. The second language that was not accepted, but it still merits discussion, is starts out very much the same, has a written description of the responsibilities of all parties signing the MOU, an annual review conducted by the accredited veterinary medical program, and a mechanism for ensuring that the consumer is protected as the student is training at the site. So the next page then kind of outlines what we see are the major discrepancies. And again, I recognize that there was a motion that was seconded and passed, but there are times when you've got a 5-4 vote that it does warrant a little bit more exploration. Does the first version give the VMB, one of the concerns, does the first version, the accepted version, give the VMB and the legislature unnecessary authority over the curriculum and allow intrusion? Because there is reference to the educational objectives, the written description of them. Is the way that that's written, does that now put the legislators in a situation where they may be able to insert certain language? So
and you're talking about A and B, right? Just for clarity, not both bolds, or?
I'm talking about A5B. I'm talking about the second paragraph, which is the paragraph that is well, yes, the second bold paragraph.
The second bold paragraph.
Okay.
You're only talking about that. Okay,
the
thank you.
The first paragraph, there is no significant controversy over.
Okay.
Okay. So all of this is about the second paragraph.
Okay.
So does the first version give the legislature the ability to intrude? That was the question. Is the language in the first version redundant, since the COE guidelines that are stated in it are already in effect by the accredited school? These are COE accredited schools. So is that language even necessary? And I think, again, this is a key point. If we were to cross out the second paragraph entirely, and we know that COE schools need to have an MOU, and that MOU looks exactly like the language that's in the second paragraph, have we accomplished our task and we don't need a whole second paragraph? The item C, does the removal of, and now this is referencing the not bold second paragraph, so hang with me here. Does the removal of the references to educational objectives in the second version reduce the clarity of the section? And so one of our discussions comparing and contrasting the first and the second paragraphs was that there's a pretty clear roadmap about what you need to have in that MOU with the accepted language. It's less clear with the not adopted language, the not bold language. However, if you go back to what the COE requests for off-campus sites, it is clear. It's all there, and these are COE-approved schools. And then finally, with the not accepted language, the item 3, a mechanism for ensuring that the consumer is protected as the student's training at the site. Thoughts for or against this consumer protection component in this second version? Is it misplaced here? Because if we feel that we need that piece, ought we not to have that piece in the first paragraph as well? Or are there already other statutes and regs that actually do protect the consumer, sign postage that students are trained here and things of that sort? And one of the comments was that the way that the accepted language was written, it was actually overly focused on the quality of the education. It was actually more about the student's experience than it was in protecting the consumer. So that is the discussion. I do have Dr. John Pasco and Dr. Ron Terra here, who were on the subcommittee that helped us write this language. Certainly their input is desired as well if they would like to come up and speak. But that's what I got for you.
I must say you do some mighty good thinking in that MDAC committee.
Yeah.
A lot of work.
Judy?
So the whole point that I can recall that we've been talking about this for a number of years is consumer protection. And I've heard stories of people through the years that have gone to these off-site or on-site and had issues and could never have any not follow-up, but ramifications to the issues. So, I mean, the greatest thing is the consumer protection. I mean, that's why this thing came up in the first place. So I can't tell. I mean, in going through A, B, C, and D, the first thing I say to A was no. B, I said yes. And then I kind of got lost because I just want it to be clear, protect the consumers, make sure the animals are getting taken care of at the utmost, and that there's no room for any ambiguity. And right now, A is pretty clear, but B and the other B seem to be pretty confusing. I mean, the one that's not bold spells out a mechanism for ensuring that a consumer is protected as the student is at a training site. Well, that seems like that's mandatory to put in there because that was the point of the whole thing. But yet, that's not in the bold one, and it does speak more to what's happening on that site in the clinical training. So it seems like the bold B would be okay if it had that sentence, or maybe the bold B isn't right and the unbold B is. But I'm voting for the unbold B because of that sentence. Does any of that make sense to you?
It does. I think that the issue here was to actually formalize supervision as much as anything. And again, there's an important insertion in that first paragraph which refers to immediate supervision for surgery.
Okay.
And so, yeah.
Before we go on, this is not final language that you're submitting to us?
We have voted and
This is
passed
the final
the bold
language. Okay.
language.
That's why it's-
So,
And so
to that-
I'm offering you alternatives to muddy the waters.
Okay. I'm going to completely disagree with your assessment on the bold B versus the unbold B,
Okay,
specifically in related to consumer protection.
okay.
As I read it, bold B will provide a higher level of assurance because it specifically says what we're making sure is there are veterinary students that are going to be practicing veterinary medicine, diagnosing, treatment, in some cases surgery. We want to make sure that those students have the proper training, the proper education, and the proper supervision to do those tasks because they're not licensed yet. And that is what the bold B says. It says you have to ensure that the formal curriculum and clinical training is appropriate. There's a mechanism for assessing that you've actually learned what you're supposed to learn. And that's much more clearly defined in bold B. The issue was that the universities had thought that would, well, I won't go into that, but
So maybe just add
unbold
3 to bold B
No,
then.
the unbold B one says, just make sure that there's a mechanism for consumer protection. So it's less clear on the unbold B. If you do all of those things that are in bold B, the consumer is going to be protected.
Yeah, but I think adding a mechanism for ensuring that the consumers, I mean, there's
If
no
you
harm
added
done.
that, exactly what more are you asking to be done that is not already on here?
Well, why is that omitted?
Tell me what more you want. Don't,
Chair Nunez, I want to step in to agree with you, and I think what you're saying is what's being described in bold B provides what is being referred to in unbold B, which is protection of consumers by,
if you add just a
Student training.
mechanism to ensure,
It doesn't.
because
then,
mean.
then
Yeah.
What is that?
it's
frankly,
left to interpretation.
unbold B is so vague, I don't know what we're instructing them to do by saying, make sure you've got a mechanism to protect
So let's
consumers.
just walk through the bold together. I know we read it, but we read it through as we were just going over it. But wait, Dick has something first. Do you want to say something before we? Okay. So John, will you read it to us?
Sure.
And
So if this is we're talking about 4830A5B, okay?
yeah, the bold one, so I can understand what Mark is saying.
So if a student is in an off-campus or distributive site as part of their formal curriculum, then there needs to be an MOU between the accredited veterinary medical program and the off-campus site. And in that MOU, there must be
Wait, stop.
Yep.
Do you understand that?
Yeah, that I
Okay.
got, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, go on.
So in that MOU, there must be a written description of the educational objectives that are expected to be achieved, an annual review by the formal curriculum, by the accredited veterinary medical program, to make sure that the educational program is being delivered as the MOU outlines.
So can I interrupt? So that means I'm UC Davis. Is that who's in the room with us today? Okay.
And Western U is here.
And Western U. Okay. So I have an off-site program at, I don't know, could it be
It could
at
be
a
one block-
Petco?
Could be one block away
It could be,
from-
right, it could
Okay.
be anywhere, right. And I have an MOU with this off-site place that says, you're going to be performing X, Y, and Z in a learning environment. You're going to be performing these tasks, and we're going to come and check on you in, an annual review conducted by the accredited veterinary medical program. So someone from Davis or Western U is going to physically go there on an annual basis, which maybe that's not enough, to be honest with you. I would feel better if it was probably twice a year, to ensure that the educational program is being delivered in accordance with the MOU, to ensure that the formal curriculum and clinical training is appropriate, and a mechanism for assessing training outcomes of the educational process, so that they're getting what they want out of the program, obviously. So why, if, now just bear with me because I'm trying to understand this. If we go to unbold B, it has the formal curriculum is in place of an on-campus education. The MOU exists. Okay, a written description of responsibilities is in place in the MOU. An annual review is conducted. So that's everything we just read in the bold. An off-site campus site, what is this? Conducted by the accredited off-site campus, right? So that's Western or Davis. In the MOU are being accomplished, and a mechanism for ensuring that the consumer is protected as a student is a training at the site.
Judy, what mechanism? That's so vague. What's the mechanism?
A mechanism for ensuring that the consumer is protected. Well, I guess what we always talked about in the early years, and I'm talking about 6 years ago when I first joined the board, was that there was no way for the vet board to if they needed to take disciplinary action of someone at a university or at these off-site things, right? That if somebody did something wrong, this training or the vet that's there, that there was no disciplinary action we could take on that person, right? That's the goal. I think we're still at today. Is that not the goal?
Not really. That
No.
university licensure solved that particular issue.
Okay, so that solved that. So what are we trying to solve right now?
We're trying to allow students to get an education and do things that veterinarians do, but they're not veterinarians. So this is exemption language. This is saying that these individuals that we're going to call students get to pretend like they're veterinarians, but under this set of circumstances.
So what gives us the right as a board to take disciplinary action over those students who are acting like a veterinarian at this off-site facility?
There is a licensee that is clearly tied to that student, and it is explicit what level of supervision that licensee must have in order for this to be allowed.
Based on the MOU with the university? No, just based on their license.
A5A, based on the
Right,
first
based on
paragraph.
their license. Okay, go ahead, Diane.
Well, all I want to do is reiterate Lee's comment, or Dr.
I'm Ms. here.
Okay. I just want to reiterate the comment because I'm not going to chime in on the specific language here, but one thing that is really important, if you're going to be drafting anything that's going to be relied on by anybody, you need to really get out of the whole idea of flowery language and everything. You just need to really focus on, is this specifically going to explain what needs to be done or what needs to be followed or whatever to the reader. And very well taken comment that when you use words like mechanism, unless you can specifically define what you
The
mean
mechanism is, yeah.
what you mean by that, then that is not a word to be used. And we have these issues all the time with vague and ambiguous language, and it is so important to just be very simple. Write what you mean, say what you mean, so it's very obvious.
And do you feel that in the bold one, then, the one that they voted on? Are you?
Commenting on the specific language.
I'm
She's
not,
just
but it
commenting on
uses the
vagueness.
same language, so I would therefore say that that's not really the best language to be used. So
But it's different because it's a mechanism for assessing training outcomes of the educational process versus a mechanism for ensuring consumer protection.
Before we get too far into wordsmithing language, we need to remember this is a legislative proposal. Ledge Council is going to get a hold of this, and they are going to tweak language to hopefully qualify the intent here.
I understand, but
I respect the comments, but I just don't want us to get bogged down in all of the language. I really want us to understand.
Voting on something?
let me just say
Here, we
something.
have to
I
get
don't
bogged
either,
down
but
somewhat.
I don't think you guys should just rely on, somebody else is going to take care of it. I think it's the best form of practice to send your best product out
Right.
there. And if you know ahead of time that things are vague, you should do the work now, because then there's there's fewer issues to be dealt with at the next level.
And
So
oil or
it's a little
whatever.
bit of time spent is worth it at this point.
One other point of clarity, Dr. Klingborg, in all of your fine reporting work that you have done here, I do want to call out one thing that yesterday when the MDC approved the language in bold B, they did strike in place of an on-campus education, because there was the comment by Diana Hagel that in somehow means that we're replacing formal education instead of it being about the site that it was occurring in. So where it says we're off-campus, bold B, bold 5AB, where off-campus or distributed sites provide the formal curriculum, comma, a memorandum of understanding between the accrediting bodies. And Judy, I think the major difference between the bold and the unbold is really, it boils down to the educational objectives being a component of that MOU. So a written description of educational objectives expected to be achieved at the site.
Yeah, that's got to be clear.
Right.
Yeah.
And the other thing about ensuring consumer protection, it feels redundant. That's what we're supposed to do
I get
with
it.
everything that we enforce, is it's about consumer protection. So the student's a consumer here. The public is a consumer here. Even the universities are consumers, for that matter. What we're looking at is if we're going to start allowing veterinary students to have a wider range of opportunity to learn the skill sets that they need to become competent entry-level practitioners, what are the expectations of those off-site settings in terms of supervision and educational objectives? And that's really what it boils down to. And I think either one of these could accomplish that. It's just how much detail do you want to see in the language that we would put forward to the legislature, or how broad do you want this to be when we move this forward? And that's really where we're at today.
For Dr. Sullivan,
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there's language in another place that says if there are students doing surgery, there has to be posting. I think there is language in other parts of our regulation that say that if a student is there diagnosing, treating, and doing surgery, that there needs to be posting for the public. So I think that adds to the public protection.
Dr. Nolan.
I have a question about the COE. Have there been issues with these off-site or remote training sites that are causing this, or because it's been happening for a while?
So I think we've heard anecdotally that there has been some complaints, or at least some maybe unfortunate occurrences with students in off-site facilities. They're anecdotal. We don't have raw data to share with you. But I can tell you that there's two things. This gives the student a purview to do. Right now they can't do surgery, or they're not supposed to be doing surgery in these sites. So it really does expand the breadth of experience the student's going to get, while at the same time adding this layer of, hey, if you're going to be doing these things, check these boxes, because we want to make sure that those sites have contracts, MOUs, educational objectives, and that the student that is participating is at a point in their program where they've had a learning exposure.
Yeah, right.
Thank
They're
you.
not too junior.
Thank you.
Kathy?
I just want to clarify one thing for my own benefit. We're not talking about students that do rotations at AVMA or VCAs, for instance, for oncology and things like that, or are we? With VCNA, let's say VCA would need an MOU with Davis or whatever, and they do not now have such a thing.
No, they do.
Okay.
They do.
Yeah, okay.
Dr. Sullivan.
Yeah, I think this came out of concern not for what Davis and Western are doing. They're doing all of this.
Right.
Our concern was students coming from other states getting experience in this state without having an MOU, and doing surgery in a real fuzzy, in my opinion, illegally, or diagnosing and treating.
Under a veterinarian.
So this is, in my opinion, cleaning it up, and it's the MOU that's the link. It's the paper trail.
Got it.
Can I just add one? I've heard, and I don't have anything specific, but that there has been friends that have gone to places that they called more or less chop shops because they were doing spay and neuter or whatever, and it was students, and things went really, really wrong. So, and I don't know if they were out of state, in state, whose program, but I've heard this in my past. So hopefully this would, all right, so that's that. You have something to
For
say.
the purpose of the webcast, could you introduce yourself?
Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Ron Terra. I'm representing Western University of Health Sciences College of Veterinary Medicine.
Where?
Western in Pomona, California. I'm sorry. I can speak up.
That's better, thank you.
Some people say I don't even need this.
Probably better.
He'll tell you you do.
I'm going to speak first to the proposed language, and I'll fess up and I'll own the non-bold version myself. And I agree with each and every one of you. Point 3 in the non-bold second paragraph is extremely vague. It was brought out yesterday by a person sitting exactly in your seat that there is something in either the BPC or the CCR or the Practice Act that states exactly what Dr. Sullivan was saying. And so that is a responsibility of a licensed veterinarian in the state of California to point that out to their clients. That would be a mechanism to ensure consumer protection. The whole point I want to try to make today is I don't think we need either version of paragraph B at all. We are an accredited school of veterinary medicine according to the American Veterinary Medical Association Council on Education. In becoming accredited, we had to satisfy a written description of the educational objectives in every single course within our curriculum. We also had to demonstrate as a strictly distributive model, our Western is strictly distributive. We do not really have a on-campus teaching hospital. We had to demonstrate that there was an annual review, and in fact that is bi-monthly or monthly at least rather than annually, conducted by our program at the off-campus sites, ensuring that the educational curriculum that we want delivered to our students is actually being delivered. And point 3, a mechanism for assessing the training outcomes is in place in 3 or 4 different ways at our program. In order to get accredited, we had to meet those 3 points already. So a student at an accredited veterinary medical program, and I'm assuming let's just pick Kansas State, if they start sending students here and it is part of their formal curriculum, then they will have to also satisfy the standards that the COE has set for distributive clinical education. And then as I brought up just now, it is already codified that the consumer is protected as long as it's under a licensed veterinarian. I guess that's the other point. This part of the formal curriculum has to be under a licensed veterinarian. And as a former private practitioner, 24 years in private practice, food animal medicine, students from Davis, I would sit there and observe them, immediate supervision, as they sutured the skin clothes on this cow, knowing full well that I was the one doing that suturing at the same time. They didn't do it, I did it. That was a level of responsibility that I took upon myself. So hopefully, and that's the final thing, our distributive sites that we use go through a rather extensive process, and we don't have, and I know you use the term loosely, we don't have chop shops as an approved off-site, a distributive site that our students can go to. Yes, they can go to a VCA, they can do cardiology there, they can do oncology, they can do surgery there. They don't really do those things unless they demonstrate to the licensed veterinarian that they can do certain things. But when it comes to surgery, our students really don't do a whole lot at these sites. And one final thing, I don't know, I really like the language of paragraph A because The closest that we've come is a student at a site that was supposed to have immediate supervision while they were doing surgery that did not. And we had no legal recourse against that site. And we as a university, took responsibility for our students' error that they made that should have been corrected by a veterinarian with immediate supervision.
Why are you opposed to the MOU piece?
We already have one. It's part, I'm sorry, I failed to mention that. As part of the COE's accreditation standards, we have MOUs in place. That doesn't need to be repeated here, we don't think, which is why paragraph B should be removed. And A would be the one that we'd want to keep in.
And what's the harm in leaving B in?
I'm sorry?
And what's the harm in leaving B in?
As Dr. Klingborg has already mentioned with the discussion yesterday is, does that version, paragraph B in the bold, does that give the Veterinary Medical Board and the legislature unnecessary authority over the curriculum and allow intrusion? And that's the way we interpreted it at Western.
Well, on the flip side, it seems like it would help ensure that wherever this distributed site is, that they're doing what we think they're doing and that they're not doing something else.
And we do that when we visit the site and evaluate the site, talk to the students about the educational experience they're getting at the site. We're doing this all already, and I guess the other thing is we're satisfying the AVMA's accreditation requirements, and this would be another level that we'd have to satisfy, even though they're equal right now in the way this is written.
But if the board or the legislature does exercise that potential authority, you can just produce the MOU that you already have.
I miss your last part.
You can just produce the MOU that you already have.
Exactly. But
and we will be
why does it need to be in
satisfied, I
place
promise
when we
you.
are?
I see what you're saying. Oh, yeah, they already have it in place, so they're already satisfying B. It would be who wouldn't be satisfying B necessarily. Got it.
So I move that we go ahead and accept 4830 A and B, except in B, we delete in place of on-campus education in the second line.
Are you talking about bold B?
Bold B.
Okay.
Why, and I'm sorry, why are we deleting in place of on-campus education? Oh, because we're only talking off-site.
It was already deleted, and what we've been given is inaccurate.
Okay.
So what they voted on yesterday deletes the words "in place of on-campus education."
Because they still have to go to school.
Yeah, got it. It can't all be distributed.
I will second the motion.
The motion and second, any additional comments or questions from the board? Any additional questions or comments from members of the public? Call for a vote, please.
Dr. Nunez?
Yes?
Dr. Waterhouse?
Yes.
Dr. Nolan?
No.
Dr. Sullivan?
Yes.
Jennifer Laredo?
Yes.
Kathy Buller?
Yes.
Lee Heller?
Yes.
And Judy Mancuso?
Aye.
Okay, motion carries.
So I think you're about a third of the way through your report, and I'm not letting you go to lunch until we get through this report.
I'm starving.
So this is going to feel a little bit like the conversation we just had.
Can we eat first?
No.
But hang with me here. We can get through this.
Come on, John.
We have language 2027, which existing language says a junior or senior student or a graduate of a recognized veterinary college listed in section 2022A.
Or a graduate is struck out, though.
Just let me
All right,
continue,
keep going,
please.
but it's strike out.
Existing language says a junior or senior student or a graduate of a recognized veterinary college listed in section 2022A who is performing any animal health care task in a veterinary premises registered by the board may perform only the identical job tasks with the identical degree of supervision by the supervisor as specified for an RVT pursuant to section 2036. This came about. There were two issues we had with this language. And the first was the or a graduate component. And the issue there is that a DVM student, an individual who has graduated from a DVM program, the way this is written, can function as an RVT forever without ever actually passing a licensing exam. So that is problem number one. And of course, that language was created to allow a graduate who had not yet passed the state or national board exam or been able to sit for the exam for whatever reason and get their license. It was created so that that individual could still be engaged with the profession until such time as they were able to pass the exam. But it has become kind of a blank check. So that was the first thing.
So they never ever take the exam?
There was, I don't even
The
know if
time
there's an
didn't come.
individual that is practicing as an RVT under this, but we recognized this potential issue when we were looking at this.
Okay, got it, thank you.
The other part to this was that the way that curricula are designed these days, that some students actually have exposure to certain tasks earlier on in their curriculum than their junior or senior year. And so we proposed language that is their proposed CCR 2027 that basically says that a veterinary student may perform an animal health care task provided they have received prior training in these tasks as part of the formal curriculum. But they may only perform identical job tasks with the identical degree of supervision as an RVT. So that was the language that was proposed yesterday for that particular issue. And we ended up moving backwards, and that is why Judy, you see, or a graduate crossed out of current 2027.
Got it.
Because we then moved back away from that veterinary student who had received prior training and went back to junior or senior student. And so the language that we voted on yesterday and passed is current 2027 with the strikeout. Now, we still have the graduate that we're going to deal with, but right now we're dealing with 2027. And let me be very clear about who this individual is. This is not a student functioning within their normal curriculum. This is not part of the formal curriculum. This is a student that comes home on the weekend, whom I've mentored, is home, and she wants to do some veterinary stuff while she's hanging out with her folks and come into the clinic. But it only allows her to do tasks up to the level of an RVT. So let's be clear, she won't be doing surgery with me because I don't have an MOU with her as we just passed, or with the school, all right? So this is a different entity, this particular student, than somebody who's functioning within the formal curriculum. Okay. So that is the language that is in front of you at this stage.
So just to clarify, what's proposed is neither the proposed but the current with the strikeout.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Just because proposed is
The proposed
confusing.
became unproposed.
Okay,
But
so
you
the-
need to see the train of thought.
Yes.
But what's
Okay?
actually being proposed is current with the strikeout.
Yes.
Thank you.
Do we have to make a motion to accept it? I'll make a motion to accept the strikeout.
You'd be making a motion to accept it, that the current 2027 with the strike.
Correct, yes.
I'll second it.
Been motioned and seconded. Any further questions from the board? Any input from members of the public?
John Pascoe from UC Davis. I actually think that the proposed language is clearer and more relevant, and I think more flexible in the long term than the current 2027 with the strikeout. And the two things that I think provide clarity is by removing junior or senior, it acknowledges the flexibility and the evolution of veterinary curricula where students are getting trained in these tasks much earlier than they did historically. And the provision there that they have provided that they have received prior training in these activities as part of the formal curriculum, I think puts the onus on the discussion between the student and the licensee that they have in fact received that training. So I think that there's no argument at all about striking graduate, because that is confusing in the current language, and that there's a second section, as Dr. Klingborg said, that deals with that. But I think the proposed language, which wasn't passed yesterday, removing the restriction for junior and senior and inserting the bit about that they've had prior training, accomplishes a much better overall objective.
Could you address that point?
Well, I'm challenged here because it's not my intent ever as chair of the committee to have a discussion and have the committee come forward with the decision and then come here and relitigate. Okay. Now, I felt that that was important because of the 5-4 vote that we had on the previous issue. And I wanted to make sure that Western University was heard on that issue and that you understood all the ramifications there. Also, I will tell you as a chair, if we had voted, and I was the last one to have voted, when I could have seen it was 4-4, I would not have broken that tie. So, that's just the way that I would run a meeting. I do think that the language that was passed is comfortable. And that's why that is the language that has moved forward. There are a lot of moving parts to the language that we had initially as part of the proposal. I do think it's more progressive. It is more liberal, but we stumbled over issues such as how do you decide if that person has appropriate training in that particular task. And we were talking specifically about things like dental extractions. And again, the conversation was, well, how do you decide that anybody that you hire has appropriate training? You do your due diligence as you would. You're not just going to send them out there and have them do it. But in the end, the committee voted for this language, which was comfortable. And I will admit that I said, okay, well, great, folks, that's job security for us, because I think this is going to come back around again to try and keep up with the fact that the curricula does change and that we need to allow some flexibility.
Okay. Any other comments from the public? Then it's been motioned and seconded and discussed to adopt the current 2027 with the strikeout of or a graduate. Call for the vote.
Dr. Nunez?
Yes.
Dr. Waterhouse?
Yes.
Dr. Nolan?
I have to abstain.
Okay. Dr. Sullivan?
Yes.
Jennifer Laredo?
Yes.
Kathy Bowler?
Yes.
Lee Heller?
Yes.
And Judy Mancuso?
Aye.
So the second part of this was in regards to that particular graduate that I had referenced who has not been licensed for whatever reason. And we were admonished yesterday by legal counsel because we kept referring to that unlicensed graduate as having not passed an exam. And it was made clear to us there are many reasons why somebody may not have gotten their license. It's not just because they failed to test. So sometimes life intervenes. But again, the intent of this particular section was to allow that individual who was unlicensed but a graduate of a program to be able to be engaged in the practice of veterinary medicine at some level until they are able to get their license. And so you have proposed CCR 2027.5, and the term for 1 year from the date of graduation was proposed for that individual. However, as we looked at this, there was significant concern about that person still not being a licensee of some sort for even that potential year. And so there was limited recourse. We do have recourse of the supervising veterinarian over that individual, but there was limited recourse. And so we took an interesting strategy and chose to table this so that you could tell us what you wanted us to do.
No,
And-
it's called passing the buck.
And the other part of that is a discussion about whether or not graduated DVMs should be eligible to sit for the RVT exam. And in doing so, then maybe we do accomplish what we're trying to accomplish with something like 2027.5 here, and we enable that individual to get a license. So there's two parts to this now. Again, the second part first. Will this board consider directing the MDC into looking at the possibility of allowing a graduate DVM who is not licensed for whatever reason to sit for the RVT exam?
Yeah.
My opinion as far as recourse goes, there's similar recourse for the veterinary students that are performing RVT task because this is not part of their curriculum. The responsibility is to the license holder. And it would apply to those students that have graduated within 1 year. So I am comfortable with adopting the language of 2027.5. I don't think recourse is an issue in my mind. And I also think that DVM and graduates should be allowed to sit for the RVT examination, so that you would waiver all the educational requirements to go through the RVT programs. Yes, Dr. Waterhouse.
I agree with both of those items also, but I think we need to look at a third point, is that do we make this retroactive? And so people who have graduated from veterinary school, never, for whatever reason, never got their veterinary license, they've been functioning for an RVT already for 5 years, 10 years, who knows? What do we do with those?
Good point.
I would,
Say no.
I would third what Drs. Nunez and Waterhouse are saying about both of the items that you put in front of us, and I think it is really worth exploring what to do with retroactivity and what kind of timeline. Should there be a limit for length of years out of school? How would that be accommodated for? If they're sitting an RVT exam and they're demonstrating competency, maybe it doesn't matter. And in fact, the opposite might be true. All that time working would be on-site education, but it's something that it sounds like the committee really needs to think about.
Just to be clear, I think if the language says for a period of 1 year, then we don't need to go back too far.
That would be retroactive a year
Well,
ago.
yeah, it's a year. And if they've been functioning as an RVT outside of the 1 year, my interpretation of the law would be that that's unlicensed activity.
There's already a definition of when a DVM graduate can take the DVM test, right? It has to be within 5 years of graduating from a veterinary
So
program.
why would we not allow a student who's graduated to take the RVT exam after 2 years or 4 years or 5 years? I mean, it should be based on their competency, right? So how can we instruct the committee to look at that issue rather than saying if you're more than a year out, you can't even sit this exam?
Oh, they can take the exam, but they can't function as an RVT for more than 1 year.
I think what John is saying is we're going to give them a 1 year period of grace to take the test, no matter how many years they've been out practicing, if they've been out, and if they've been out 10 years out of school and have acted as an RVT, they have a year this next year to take that test to then become licensed. Isn't that what you were saying?
Yep, yes.
And then otherwise, it makes sense.
How can they act as an RVT if they haven't been, for 10 years if they haven't been an RVT?
It's allowed in the old regulation.
Under this,
Can we kick it back to MDC?
Yeah.
Yeah, take it back.
There isn't, I mean, you can allow someone to sit for an exam regardless of how many years out they've been, if that's the policy decision of the board. It's not really a legal decision, it's a policy decision. And it sounds like we don't know what the right answer is today because we haven't examined the issue, and so perhaps the MDC can look at, they can only practice for a year, but should we attach some sort of time frame within which they have to take the exam before they'd be considered an eligible candidate? For veterinarians, as Dr. Nunez pointed out, they have their exam scores kind of expire after 5 years, and then they'd have to either qualify under reciprocity or some other version of that for licensure. So I think that the most prudent thing to do today is to ask the MDC to look at the window.
I say we don't kick it back and we just go with what's already in law. They haven't, right? I mean, you're done with this? You wanted us to
No, there's nothing in law.
finalize
that-
it? Oh, you're not done with it?
So what I'm hearing is the board's okay with the allowing graduates to practice or perform tasks under supervision and so forth for a year.
2027.5.
Yes, 2027.5, and the board also would like for the MDAC to address the window of when the graduates could potentially sit for the RVT examination. Is that the consensus of the board?
I think we should just get it done. Why can't we decide? We should be able to decide. Why is it so hard?
Because it's not agendized.
Well,
We
because
couldn't vote on it today.
There are some issues that need to be taken into consideration. I think there's more to it than that.
Well, it is a lot more than just how long. Right now, there is no pathway for a DVM to sit for the RVT exam, so we're talking about much more than just looking at the window. It's changing the laws to allow a DVM a pathway to an RVT license. So there's nothing, and we don't have language in front of us to even vote on. So we're not ready yet, Judy. It's just really the preliminary discussion about should this exist.
I was looking at John thinking he wanted us to give him an answer, so my mistake.
We would like to be directed to look at this.
So that's enough. That's
Yeah.
all you need for today
Yeah.
then. Okay, very good.
Do we have a motion put forward and how to do that?
Yeah, and just for clarity, the board did motion on 2027, and now I believe 2027.5. Is that what the motion is?
There wasn't a second. I'll second it. Mark did the motion, right? Mark?
Sure.
Dr. Nunez?
Sure.
All right, I'll second it.
Dr. Sullivan?
So if we move forward by striking or a graduate,
We already did that.
That's done.
That's done. This is
Well,
2027.
can I finish?
Oh, yeah, sorry.
So if we do that or did that, then that means a DVM that graduates with graduates from a accredited school can't do RVT work.
They can with, if we adopt 20.5.
I know, but we're sending that back.
But we're
We've
sending that
adopted
back.
2027, and we're sending this back.
No, I think they just motioned on 2027.5. That was the,
Okay.
Yeah.
We voted
He's
on
saying about the
20
time span.
We voted on 2027
Right.
with the strikeout or a
Right.
graduate. So if that moves forward and we send 2027.5 back to MDC, a new graduate who hasn't a license
I hear
cannot
what
do
you're saying.
MD,
Well, we're
cannot
not
do
sending it back
RVT
to-
tests.
We're not sending it back to MDC. We're motioning to
Right.
adopt 27.5. We're not sending it back.
Right.
What we're sending back is the possibility of the DVMs taking the exam for the RVTs.
It's a path to the RVT.
So we're accepting a regulation without definition of what it means?
I apologize, Board, I'm trying to figure out, so just procedurally, because 2027 would come, has now been accepted with the strikeout of or graduate. The way I see the landscape rolling out here is that you sent that, the board has now accepted that. So my presumption is, I was speaking to the XO, what that means is when you commence your January board meeting, you will determine whether to initiate rulemaking on that. So you've accepted it, we'll put it on the agenda, as I understand it, for the January meeting, and then at that point in time, you'll determine whether you'll decide whether you want to commence rulemaking. Okay. Now, with 2027.5, I'm a little bit perplexed because the MDC's recommendation was pump the brakes, we need to study this more. Am I correct, Dr.
Yes.
Dr. Klingberg? So the board has said, thanks, but no thanks, MDC. We'll take it from here. We want to go with the language of the year, with the understanding that what we went, going to task MDC with is go figure out if there's a mechanism by which a graduated DVM or a previously graduated DVM can sit for the RVT examination. That's what the way I have the landscape rolling out. Is that?
That's what I thought is
Right.
going on.
Okay.
So-
That's what I thought.
But we don't have a motion yet for 2827.5, do we?
I seconded Mark's motion.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. I thought we were sending it back.
Okay. So if we're not sending it-
I thought the motion was to send it back to the MDC, I'm sorry.
So, can I just ask one more clarifying question here? Assuming this motion to accept 2027.5 is adopted, but we still need the mechanism by which they can do that. If I'm a graduate, I have a year sort of waiver to continue practicing as an RVT. Can we get all the RVT pathway done in a year to allow that graduate then to be able to fulfill?
Probably not.
I think the goal is not to, so I think we're.
Because we're excluding graduates now if we take.
Right, but I think we're
we adopt
missing the
first
goal. The
one.
goal is to allow them to pass the NAVLE. These people went to vet school with the intention of becoming a veterinarian.
Right.
So this year of RVT practice gives them an opportunity to pass the NAVLE. If they couldn't pass the NAVLE, then what the policy decision seems to be on the table is, should we give them a pathway to become an RVT? And what does that look like? To
Okay.
answer your question, regs would not be done in a year.
Yeah, right.
So,
Exactly.
so this wouldn't even be in effect in a
Okay,
year.
right,
Exactly.
ours. And I was actually thinking it wasn't passing the NAVLE, it was passing our licensing board.
But it would be both to be a
But-
veterinarian.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, point of clarification, did you want to take these things as separate, the motion on adopting 2027.5 and the direction to the MDC?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
that seems to make more sense to me.
Yeah.
Yes, the only thing that's
It's-
been motioned is 20.5.
Yeah, we already did that.
So maybe I have a question for Kurt. So, so if we do pass this, and it says that they can only do this for 1 year, so again, back to the retroactive point, does that mean that anybody who's been practicing, who's a graduate DVM, but been practicing as an RVT for more than 1 year, they have to stop on the date this bill passes?
It's an unclear question, because generally speaking.
So I think we
folks-
need some provision in there
Sure.
for that.
Sure,
A
so
year from
generally
the date of
speaking,
passage.
regulations and legislation looks forward.
Forward.
It's prospective,
Yes.
unless there's a clear retroactive intent.
Right.
As
Grandfather.
usually found in the circumstances or the intent of the mechanism itself. So my theory is after the date, if this were to pass, my initial reaction, and again, this is very temporal because it's just to ask the question, was that it would be from those people who graduated after the date this regulation became effective. So those people that are already in this slot would probably continue on unabated. So you would not capture those going backwards, you capture those going forward. So let's say that in fact I graduated in 2019, then I would have until 2020 theoretically to make my choice about what I want to do when I grow up. Those that were in 2016, 2015, until that date would continue on and be allowed to continue to practice in this endeavor. So the reason I say that is because these people are not licensed by us. And so if they were, you could say something like, anybody in this capacity got some sort of additional authority from the board, and it would only be issued for 3 consecutive years. And then within consecutive years, the exemption is over. But we don't do that here. These are just sort of sub-rows of people that are just keeping going because they don't really have anything they're not licensed by us.
So under the current language, if I understand you correctly, because there's nothing retroactive, if we have someone who's already doing this or doing it any time up to when the law goes into effect, they can continue to do this indefinitely.
That's my initial
Is that the intent of the board?
Yes, I think so. For up to 1 year after passage.
No, but Kathy, for people who've already been doing it, this wouldn't apply. They can continue to do it indefinitely. That's what I'm asking. Is that the intent of the board? That
Got it.
people who are already in this place
Dr.
can
Sullivan.
continue indefinitely?
I do have a problem with that.
Yeah.
We have been veterinary assistants doing veterinary RVT tasks that we don't have a license to pursue. So I think the whole purpose of this is so that we've got an avenue to pursue activity without having to go the route of unlicensed activity.
And I think we need to separate two things. One is about them being able to practice for a period of time. What I think Dr. Waterhouse is talking about is someone who may want to qualify for the exam. And how many years have they been out there? And I think that's what we're tasking the MDC to do, is look at the pathway to examination, including, does it only apply to new graduates, or does it apply to anybody who is a graduate? So that's part of that. That's not been defined yet. This practice for 1 year, and I just had to get clarification from Kurt, I think we need to look at this and provide further direction to the board, because when a reg goes into effect, everybody complies with it unless it says, for any graduate after 1989 and forward. Typically, once it's on the books, you comply. So I don't know that I completely understand it wouldn't apply to anybody who's already doing it, because that's not how regulation implementation typically works. Unless you have a grandfather clause in there, you typically, it's adopted, and then you enforce it.
What I would suggest then is that, since there is a concern by this board that we need to address those DVM graduates that are performing RVT tasks currently, we need to address that point. That I would suggest that we not adopt the motion that's on the table and send both of the issues back to MDC.
Are you withdrawing your motion?
Oh, I can withdraw it? I'll withdraw it. I withdraw it. Even though I don't think there's a whole lot of DVM graduates that are doing this, but it's, then
I know one.
then I withdraw the motion.
A lot of them are foreign graduates.
Seems to make sense.
So I guess then it would be my obligation. So we're going to leave, just so we're going to leave 2027 alone, because we've already got that.
Yeah, that's been adopted.
Okay, so then 2027.5, I just want to make sure, this is sort of a hot button issue for me, because again, we have the presumption of prospectivity, not retroactivity. And I want to make sure that I give the board the best legal advice. So perhaps an incumbent upon the withdrawal of the motion would be to direct me to answer that question for the upcoming January meeting, so that the board has a good jumping off point when it considers this item again.
And you probably report your findings to the MDC as we kicked it back to them.
Okay.
Now, do we have a motion on the alternate pathway thing?
Yes.
We do.
No, because there's no mechanism in place. That needs to go back to
Well, that we're looking into, that
I don't
Kurt's
think-
going to give direction.
I don't think you need now we're talking about the other issue. I don't think you need a motion, you just need consensus of the board to
Well, it
continue
needs to be
looking at this.
assigned to the MDC, I guess. Is
Oh,
what
it
I'm
hasn't, the
asking.
MDC's not already working on it? Oh, okay.
That would be item number 12 to add to your list.
Yeah.
I would be happy to move, if I didn't realize it wasn't already assigned, that we direct the MDAC to take up the issue of whether and how and when a DVM graduate should be allowed to sit for the RVT exam.
Right.
I second.
Jennifer seconded very quietly.
Any further questions from the board? Any questions or comments from members of the public? Call for the vote.
Dr. Nunez?
Yes.
Dr. Waterhouse?
Yes.
Dr. Nolan?
Yes.
Dr. Sullivan?
Yes.
Jennifer Laredo?
Aye.
Kathy Buller?
Aye.
Lee Heller?
Aye.
Judy Mancuso?
Yes.
Downhill stretch, folks.
Guys, we got rodeos.
Rodeo.
So, this agenda item, discuss committee recommendation authorizing an RVT under the supervision of a veterinarian to be the on-site practitioner for rodeos.
Yes.
And what I'm going to read from you was what the legislature sent back as part of the Sunset Review document. It should be required that the management of any professionally sanctioned or amateur rodeo that intends to perform in any city or county shall ensure that there is a licensed veterinarian present at all times during the performances of the rodeo, or an RVT who is under the appropriate degree of supervision of the veterinarian for those animal health care tasks that may be performed by the RVT at a rodeo event. The on-call requirement for a veterinarian should be considered as insufficient to provide for appropriate oversight and the immediate treatment of injured animals at rodeo events. So that was what came from the legislature. The board had responded that RVTs may provide emergency care and treatment at rodeos pursuant to BPC 4840.5 without a veterinarian present. Also, Section 2069 of the CCR allows for specific aid and treatment that an RVT may provide for an animal under the conditions of an emergency: application of tourniquets and pressure bandages, administration of pharmacologic agents under the direction of a veterinarian, temporary splints or bandages, cardiac resuscitation, intubation, etc. The board made it clear that an RVT may provide treatment at a rodeo event under current law and regulation to assess in emergency situations. So we did respond, and we discussed this yesterday, and short of perhaps adding a couple of potential tasks to RVTs in emergency situations, and they were pain control and something else.
Sedation.
Sedation, okay. Short of that, we felt that the veterinarians and the RVTs have accomplished what we're being tasked to do in this setting. And the issue here really is that the owners of these animals at the rodeos are not seeking the veterinary care of the on-site veterinarian or RVT, or waiting for the veterinarian that must be within 1 hour and on call, that they are choosing to have their own veterinarian do the work.
Or none.
Or none.
None is the default value.
And there is also 597, Penal Code 597, which clearly addresses the role of the owner and the rodeo associations in this situation, and that those animals must be seen within 1 hour when it is determined that they have an injury that requires veterinary supervision.
But there's no enforcement.
So that's correct. There is no enforcement, but that's not the role of the veterinarian or the RVT. That's the role of the animal control community.
Yeah, so since there's no enforcement, then what's Plan B, because there's never going to be enforcement?
Well, we don't have a Plan B. So that is not up to us to solve this problem. What veterinarians are tasked with is reporting when injuries have occurred.
Right.
And it is up to the rodeo associations to make sure that there is either a veterinarian present or one within 1 hour away. It's up to them to make that call and make those arrangements. It's not up to the vet med board to make that happen.
Well, it is if the legislature tells us to do it.
Well, the legislature has asked us to actually look into the animal care aspect of this, and we have come back, the multidisciplinary committee has come back and said, perhaps what we need to do is add a couple of tasks to the emergency, the pain and the sedation component. But short of that, we cannot force an owned animal to get treatment. And that's the penal code issue, and that's not an enforcement issue with the vet med board. That's an enforcement issue with animal control. So we had a long statement that I'm going to try and read. Board response, I'm trying to read my own handwriting is the challenge. The board response to the legislature that the RVT tasks are appropriate and consistent with an on-call vet. Our findings show that it's the owner's refusal to treat the animal at the rodeo that is actually the bigger issue in this case. And so we would like to look at the issue of the establishing protocols, or looking at weaving the MDC, adding the line items of pain or sedation And we need your direction if we may go forward with that. But, we need to be very clear about what our roles and responsibilities are in this particular issue. And they are not to be the police force when an animal is injured at a rodeo. It is to provide assistance to that animal, but we can only provide the assistance that the owner allows us to provide. So we are limited, with all due respect to the legislature, in terms of what they expect from us and what we do. And a better conduit for animal care would be a requirement to have an animal control officer at
Well, yeah, but they can't treat the animal.
Well,
They
no,
can-
but-
But you're right.
but-
They should be there along with an RVT and a vet an hour away, and with any animals performing, doing anything being required. That should just be blanket.
So that's where we were at with this.
Another way to think about this is what our role is to ensure that medical treatment is being provided at the rodeos. And what we're saying is that the way to ensure that is by requiring either a veterinarian to be there, or you could also have an RVT there with a veterinarian on call.
Understood.
The MDC also explored the possibility of providing protocols that an RVT may perform, similar to protocols that are being discussed at the shelter environment. I understand the point that you're making, though, about reporting these points, but that's similar to saying that if I have a veterinary hospital in Burbank, I'm responsible for the pets that are brought to my hospital. There may be other pets that are injured and sick in Burbank, but I'm not responsible to go out and find those pets and make sure that they're brought to my hospitals.
Understood.
It would be similar at a rodeo. Our responsibility is to provide the medical services. Our responsibility is not to go out and make sure that all the animals that are injured at that rodeo come to our veterinary services.
No,
and
I
provide
agree.
them.
An animal control officer should be there. And if an animal control officer picked up a dog that just got hit in Burbank and brought it to you, you would treat it. And that is the same scenario,
Yes.
what we're talking
But
about.
we don't have authority
don't
over
have that.
animal control officers.
No, but it could be something that goes back to the legislature, that yes, an RVT can be there with those additional pain and sedation, but maybe then BMP could run something that says an RVT can be there, but it should be required there's animal control that stops in or is there or something. I don't know.
Dr. Sullivan.
Animals can't dial 911.
I'd like to have you change the bold print there. I think we need to take practitioner out, because that's saying an RVT is a practitioner. So maybe to be on site, emergency care person for the rodeos or something.
Practitioner right there.
It's just in John's notes.
What's the word you're replacing it with?
Anything but practitioner.
Right.
RVT cannot be a practitioner. So emergency care person for the rodeo. or
To be
something
clear, this
better.
is just in the language of the recommendation to the legislature. This isn't any kind of formal regulatory or,
Right, but I want
it's
to
in,
use the right.
I know.
I like emergency care.
Is provider a practice-protected term? I mean, is it a term with similar triggers or?
I would think so.
Okay, just looking
So
at
that is a cut and paste simply of the background
Right.
that was in our
Oh,
In the
from
sunset, it's from the
That's-
sunset
From
report.
sunset. Oh.
It's
that's
nothing we
not-
created.
That's not any kind of formally submitted language. Really, our language was that, on the last page here, that we would like the board to refer the matter to the MDC to recommend protocols under which an RVT may provide emergency care at sanctioned rodeo events in the absence of a veterinarian. And
So can I get some clarity from the board? We have an obligation to respond to the legislative request for whether or not it's appropriate to have the RVT on site to perform certain duties, and we have already responded and said, yeah, they can do the emergency care thing. Now there's a potential proposal to add, the sky is falling, to add two more additional components to that emergency care, the pain and the sedation. But in the discussion yesterday, we did cover the fact that, and Dave Johnson brought it up, that if there was an RVT on site and animals were going untreated because the owners were opting out, that the RVT would have perhaps the I don't want to say responsibility because it's really not their responsibility, but they would have the opportunity to call animal control and have animal control come in to report that the rodeo is not requiring these animals to be treated, which is part of the penal code. So it would provide an avenue for communication to have an RVT on site. And I think that's important to communicate to the legislature because I believe Dr. Druses said that is absolutely something that animal control officers are responsible for. And if there was a call from an RVT to say we have injured animals here that are going untreated because of an owner opt-out or whatever, that the animal control officer could be called in. So at this point, they're not being called in because they're not aware necessarily that there are injured animals.
They're not reporting, they're not calling, they're not doing anything.
Right. So back to the basics. The board's oversight, which we all know, is on the reporting aspect of it, not on the rodeo enforcing that when you enter your animal into a rodeo event, that you've now said, I give up my right to refuse treatment. Because that's part of a penal code, and maybe the enforcement efforts, going back to what the Senate B&P can do, is to really focus on rodeos enforcing treatment upon entry of the animals at the rodeo. But it's not the Veterinary Medical Board, as Dr. Klingborg said. We don't have authority to enforce that because that's not our law.
This is going to open a huge can of worms, so I apologize even as I say it. And I'm new enough that I don't know what a lot of the existing law is. You could certainly mandate that the on-site RVT or veterinarian report a 597 violation to animal control.
We're not an enforcement agency.
You can report it. That's not the same as enforcing. I'm not saying we should do it. I'm just saying, just like child abuse laws where a school teacher or a doctor is required to report a concern about child abuse, or a psychiatric practitioner is required to report if they feel someone is a danger to self and others. I'm not saying we should do it. I'm just saying it's a possibility.
Well,
Dr. Sullivan.
required to report.
You're right. Maybe we're already mandated to do that. But I think the history I know of when this started is that the requirements of reporting, or the requirements that were put on the veterinarians doing these rodeos, kind of drove them away from doing it. And I think the more responsibility we put on the RVT or the veterinarian on the legal enforcement part of it, even just calling, is going to keep them from participating, and that's to the detriment of the animals.
Yes, Dr. Waterhouse.
I like the idea of the animal control officer being the one that is certainly the one to sedate if that's needed, or use pain control if that's needed, because they're already legally able to carry these drugs at this point in time. It is hard to find an RVT with large animal experience. The 99% of the RVTs work in smaller practice, and it's going to be very hard to get an RVT to show up at a rodeo.
It's going to be harder to get animal control if they're not even working on a Saturday or Sunday. These things happen on weekends when there is no such thing as animal control in a lot of these offices.
There's more animal control officers than there are large animal RVTs.
It's a problem. It's a problem. And I do, and all due respect to Dr. Sullivan, I disagree about, the reporting thing. They're not reporting because they're just not being called. They don't exist. That, these owners just are letting these animals suffer.
Dr. Sullivan.
Yeah, Section 4830.5 is our obligation to report of animal abuse and cruelty, so it's already there.
It's in there somewhere. Thank you for looking that one up. It's required.
So that is going to be our response to the legislature on the rodeo issue.
Are we tasking the MDC to look at adding those other two components to the emergency care?
The protocols.
I would like to make a motion that we do that.
The pain and sedation. I don't think it's protocols. I think it was just pain and sedation.
Right.
And I'll second that motion.
Who motioned?
I did.
Okay, thank you.
Any further discussion or input from the board? From members of the public? Call for the vote.
Dr. Nunez?
Yes?
Dr. Waterhouse?
Yes.
Dr. Noland?
Yes.
Dr. Sullivan?
Yes.
Jennifer Laredo,
Yes.
Kathy Bowler,
Aye.
Lee Heller,
Aye.
and Judy Mancuso.
Aye.
So we will report to the legislature what we've discussed, in addition that the MDC is investigating adding pain and sedation to the list of emergency care
Thank you.
responsibilities.
And would you like to wrap up your report?
I would like to say that we have added a half a dozen tasks or so to the MDC, and we thank you. Yeah,
And we thank you.
yeah, absolutely.
For the purposes of just stretching this out a little too long, we should, though, because the board has an obligation to understand what your priorities are. In the packet, it's under item 8, I believe, the existing priorities, and to that, we've added exclusions for veterinary assistants, as documented from CARVDA. They're looking at those exclusions with the striking of, I believe, 4 items that we noted. A pathway for graduates to take the RVT exam, and then 2 additional emergency care components for RVTs at rodeos.
That's correct.
Do you have any additions that I...
It's simply that we also have an enforcement report that we'll be hearing at the next meeting. We did not get to compounding or to discussion of anesthesia versus sedation. We've got a drug counseling discussion that we will have at the next meeting. And there are a few other things that are there in the queue. And we'll just keep working through it as we can.
Awesome. Great work. Thank
Thanks.
you.
Thank you so much.
All right, then we will break for lunch an hour later than I thought we would.
I don't either.
We can reconvene. We are now on, who's ever left? We're on agenda item number 9, which is the legislative report. And these pretty much have all been signed by the governor at this point. So there's a good summary of the bills in your board package. And we can very, very quickly go through them. SB 1193 is the bill that extended the veterinary board to 2021, allowed for the appointment of an executive officer, allows drug compounding, creates university licenses, prohibits premise permits that have been expired for 5 years from being renewed. And there was some language in there about the Veterinary Medical Board contingency fund being available for expenditure only upon appropriation by the legislature, but Anne Marie has assured me that that is not terribly significant.
Technical language that was... It was just technical language. For whatever reason, our special appropriation was unusually written some time back, so they contacted me and said we need to make this consistent. It doesn't change the way our appropriation works.
Pet boarding facilities, SB 945, establish procedures for the care and maintenance of pets boarded at a pet boarding facility. And there was an exemption made for boarding facilities that were inside veterinary premise locations that held a premise permit. AB 2505 was that bill preventing killing of dogs and cats by using carbon dioxide. SB 1039 was the bill that was sponsored by the CBMA that closes a loophole in regards to consulting veterinarians from other states that do not hold a license in California. AB 2269 is, this is the bill in regards to animal shelters and research facilities. That one was passed. There was an amendment that was added to that bill that allowed for pets to be used by the universities for teaching purposes. SB 1348 would allow licensing boards to allow military experience and training towards fulfilling licensing requirements, and to post this information on their website. And SB 1182 would make it a felony to use certain drugs with the intent to commit sexual assault. AB 2419 was the only one that wasn't signed by the governor, but it was brought, last time it was dead, but then it was motioned for reconsideration. So I was disappointed that I wasn't going to get the chancellorship of the new University of California, because now I need something to do. Now it's still possible for me to become the chancellor of the new California, University of California. And then there's also an update on the pet lovers license plate.
There is.
Yes.
Well, the
Drum roll.
Senate Business Professions and Economic Development Committee will be working on legislation in December to transfer the program, we still hope, to CDFA, California Department of Food and Ag. And so that is moving through the process. We've engaged CDFA and we're working with them on transition. Obviously, there's been no formal positions from the department yet, but that's in the works, and you should look for legislation in December.
There's like over $800,000 in it right now, just waiting to go for spay and neuters. And think all those poor animals we need to get it out to. It's terrible. At least the money's there, right? I think. Better be.
Someone's going to have some splaining to do if it's not really.
A lot of people.
Big time splaining.
Okay. Are there any questions from the board in regards to the legislation report?
No, sir.
Any questions or comments from the public? Then moving on to agenda item 10A, which is properly tabbed. Is Candace?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Did you say 10A?
Yeah. Ooh, Candace is not
Where did Candace go? Okay. Well, we can start the discussion. I'm sure she'll be here momentarily.
good. Okay.
Kurt can fill in for Candace until Candace arrives.
I feel like the guy that was playing behind Cal Ripken.
Oh, she has really nice shoes. She always has really nice shoes. Candace is known for that.
Okay, so the first item is extending the time before a petitioner may petition for reinstatement or modification of penalty. Currently, petitions for reinstatement or modification of penalty can be made after 1 year of the effective date of the decision. Petitions are heard by the board with an administrative law judge present and are usually heard the day after scheduled board meetings. A condition has arisen related to the improvements made to a previous veterinary medical board deficiency. For years, disciplinary case resolution times had been too long. With improvements made, there is now an increase in the number of cases that have been resolved, and therefore an increase in the opportunity for petitions to be filed. The number of cases and petitions board members are asked to consider at board meetings cannot be accommodated by the current process and is resulting in a delay of petition hearings. There's also an issue of whether 1 year is a sufficient amount of time to show rehabilitation for the more egregious cases.
Yes.
So Judy agrees.
Yes. That's a big one.
So in your board package, there are 3 options that are being proposed. And there's also in your package examples of how the medical board and the pharmacy board and the dental board deals with petitions. So if Candace was here, I would have her,
I just texted
if I
her.
took out my contacts, maybe I could see Candace right there. But would you like to add anything to that presentation before we open up discussion?
Mr. President, members, so perhaps we could hear from Ms. Rainey or Ms. Sokolov on the more enforcement side. I would just like to speak about the logistical side, and that is, so if you consider option one as sort of the, we'll call it the waiting period, I would ask the members to closely look at option two, which is a little bit different. Right now, I think as Mr. President pointed out, you hear these things sort of en banc, right? You all sit in there, and then you hear them, and then you decide. So both the medical board and the dental board have a situation where they put those over and they go into the normal, the regular Administrative Act, Procedures Act practice, where it's just like a disciplinary period, just like a licensing thing, where the ALJ, who's trained, not the general trained, but who's trained to do this sort of thing, does it and then renders a decision whether to grant the petition or grant the termination or probation, and then that bubbles up to the board in closed session, just like any other procedure would. So you don't hear it in bank, but the board does not lose jurisdiction to whether to decide or not. It just kind of deliberates on the matter in a little bit different context. The proposed decision comes up to you, and then you review it. You still have the same options that are before you with any other disciplinary licensing decision, to adopt it, to reject it, make your own decision, to mitigate. So that's the other thing. Again, as a person who sits with the board in adjudication, not an investigation, and not certainly not in prosecution, I think that Mr. President pointed out an interesting point, which is suggesting that it is difficult when you consider a stipulation, which is essentially both parties bargaining for the unintended result, and you see sometimes a stipulated settlement that includes 3, 5, or 7 years probation, and then the very next year you see the petitioner respondent before you, you might think, wait a minute, you bargained, essentially, you bargained to get what you did for 1, 3, 3, 5, 7, and here you are before us in a year. And again, from a policy perspective, the question is, how does that comport with the consumer protection obligation when a year, especially in a substance abuse case, a year may not be sufficient for this board to make a determination whether petitioner's probation should be terminated or modified. So again, that's option one. That's sort of the holding off or waiting period. Not trying to suggest any firearms or anything like that, but that's sort of the option two is more of a procedural mechanism, and that is the board would hear these not in banc, but it would come up before in closed session. And option three is essentially out of my league, because that's a logistical consideration to extend the duration of a board meeting. So that's all I have to say. I'd be more than happy to answer any questions.
Dr. Waterhouse?
With option number two, we would not see the licensee then?
Correct. You would not see the licensee in person. You would see the proposed decision, and then you would have the same options that you would with any other decision. You could say, let's call for the transcripts. We'll review the paper. That you would essentially lose the opportunity to talk to the applicant face-to-face, but that opportunity would be reflected in the judges, the administrative law judges' proposed decision, which you would read. So the decision would be like, for example, instead of whether a disciplinary decision would say, I find that there's sufficient cause to discipline for this or that, this decision reads, I would find that there's sufficient rehabilitation to grant petitioner's petition for reinstatement or to terminate the probation. So you would not see them live, you would see them sort of on paper.
I kind of like seeing them live and seeing how they answer questions and seeing how appropriate their answers are. And that's my feeling.
I'm with you.
On the ALJ option, and Candace just walked back in, what kind of backlog is there in the ALJ
I would have to ask
world where all these things to initially go?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
Sorry we started without
Yeah,
you.
sorry.
But I see 2 bags of cupcakes, so hopefully there's justification.
Yeah. And there's some vegan ones in there.
There are.
Good. No, about the option two, where all petitions would go first through an ALJ hearing.
So your question was about how many?
Well,
Were we
and
seeing?
is there a backlog? I
The
mean,
backlog.
in
Address the
terms of
backlog.
ALJ jurisdictional things, would that be too much activity for ALJs?
For an ALJ? I know that the Office of Administrative Hearings has hired a lot of new judges, and from what we're seeing as far as our case scheduling for hearings and so forth, things have gotten a lot better. So I think that they've kind of addressed that issue.
Okay.
Every time.
So my thoughts on this, we're looking at the examples from the medical board and the pharmacy board and the dental board. I found it a little bit curious that we're the only board that does it a little bit differently. And in regards to the option of number 2, and assign it to a judge, would the administrative law judge be able to judge the sufficiency of a petitioner's rehabilitative efforts enough to ensure consumer protection, but also to ensure the petitioner's right to due process? Because I think there's two components when evaluating a petition. We want to make sure that the consumer is protected, but I also truly believe in a petitioner's right to due process. The participation of an 8-member medical board in evaluating a petition may result in a fairer or more just decision than that of one possibly biased judge. Those are my thoughts on that. I wholeheartedly agree with setting different levels of minimum time, which must be elapsed before a petitioner can file for reinstatement or reconsideration. And so I do like the way it was pointed out in option 1. But I don't want to, I don't support the idea of just putting them all out towards an administrative law judge. I think that there's a possibility of somewhat of a hybrid, saying that we have the option of sending it to an administrative law judge if it's not too egregious or anything like that.
That's interesting.
Sure.
What would trigger the option?
That's something that we would have to, if it falls within these levels of 1, 2, and 3, maybe the number 3 can be sent to an administrative law judge.
Can I clarify, Chair Nunez? So we're only focusing on petitions for reinstatement or modification, not new cases,
Correct.
not
Right.
first hearing. So that sort of narrows it down, and it's stuff we will have already looked at, presumably, unless it started with an ALJ.
Yeah, they're coming back at us.
Yeah.
And I mean, because the staggered schedule makes sense, and it's consistent with what several other medical boards are doing, it makes sense to me, as opposed to adding to the workload of the ALJ by saying all of these have to go there.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I understand your point about some kind of hybrid, but I'm not sure what the necessity would be for that, given that we would have already seen these, or an ALJ would have the first time out.
Well, in that process, an ALJ would be sitting with the board. So the ALJ is going to be there no matter what.
So that doesn't lighten our workload then?
Lightens ours, but not the ALJ's.
Okay.
It doubles theirs.
I
don't think the consideration should be of the ALJ's workload. That's a separate entity, and that is going to consistently do whatever it needs to do to make sure things are litigated and properly so. So I don't think that should be your focus. Because, and as Candace did aptly state, they have recently significantly increased their staff. The number 14, in just for some reason, I just remember it. I know I had a conversation. I don't exactly remember, but it was pretty substantial.
Okay. But we are partly visiting this issue because of our workload. And it does seem to me that, I'm not a big fan of option 3 myself. I think it would be tough on a lot of people to have an extra day added. And because one of the things that is, just in my limited time here, I have noticed is that we keep talking about having enough time before we can assess or reassess people, particularly people that are coming back for early revocation or reinstatement. So if that's sort of a theme in our concern about how we deal with disciplinary cases, staggering that based on the situation. So, 3 years if it's a voluntarily surrendered or revoked license, 2 years for early termination of probation of 3 years or more, 1 year for modification of shorter probations. That would probably fit our model of when we feel like we need time we need to see someone's behavior over time before we can go back and revisit their case.
And I'm under the assumption if you've gotten 5 years of probation, that means it was a pretty egregious accusation. And to expand a little bit on what Kurt said, if a person's gotten 5 years of probation, rest assured the staff has done a lot of work to come to this terms of probation. And I do think that I've seen a strategy beginning to develop with some of the attorneys is to accept whatever terms of probation you can, and then take your chances with the board after 1 year.
Yep.
They may be a little bit more
Yep,
lenient.
yep,
The 1 year
because
is
we,
definitely-
because.
And Judy agrees as well.
Well, the history,
Judy,
okay, you're not done yet? Go ahead.
No. So, you ruined my train of thought. I forgot what I was going to say. So go
Use
ahead.
the gavel, for God's sakes. No, Dick was next.
A couple of comments. First, I don't think it's broken. I don't think we have to do what everybody else is doing just to be doing it. And the numbers game is going to catch up with us. If we put them off, then 2, 3, 4 years down the road, we're going to have the same bottleneck, and we're going to have the same situation of when we hear these. I don't recall, but maybe one case that came back to us after a year, and that was a year and a half or closer to 2. I don't think it's being abused, and we've got a case coming up that I have some great concerns about the judicial process. It is not 100% accurate, and I don't see the problem that's broken.
Can I just comment on a couple of things that Dr. Nunez had to say? As far as the ability of the ALJ to sit and judge credibility and so forth, that is what they do all day, every day, on every case that they see. So the cases that are coming before you, these would be going through that same process as far as sitting before an ALJ and him hearing and judging credibility and so forth. With regard to workload, this has kind of made me go back and examine what's happened over the past couple of years as well as kind of where we are today, because where we are today with regard to, we have a very full agenda for your closed session. And we have 2 petitions waiting that we weren't able to schedule because there wasn't time. So those are being put off, and I know there's another one coming in. So essentially, we've already got 3 that are waiting until January now, provided that that's not going to be a full day as well. Having said that, there's a backlog, if you would call it that, but you have a full day of closed sessions scheduled for this meeting, and there are 8 or 9 cases still waiting to be sent out to you by mail vote between this meeting and next. So.
Okay. I think that 2 things. When I first joined the board and we had somebody come for reinstatement and then we gave them back their license early or lessened the probation, whatever it was at the time, I remember one of the board members saying, this is going to open the floodgates once the attorneys hear that the board has changed their position on this, because up until then, the board was not reducing probation and doing these reinstatements. And it was like, and then some people kind of blew that off. No, that's not going to happen. Well, it did happen. I think that there's a combination of 2 things. I think there's a combination of more cases getting done because of our staff. So, of course, the volume has gone up. But it's also what President Nunez said, that it is also a pattern and a behavior that the lawyers now, the attorneys are like, hey, just get it, let's move, and we'll be back in a year, and they'll give you less time and so all of a sudden those floodgates have opened. So I think I love this 1, 2, and 3 thing because in so many cases, I disagree with Dick. I think we do the work up front. I think our staff does the work up front. I think we as a board do our work, the ALJs. And when we give people their disciplinary action, it's thoughtful. I mean, look at what we go through, right? None of this is flippant or anything like that. I mean, we go through great strides to make sure that we're doing the right thing. And so I don't think it should be taken lightly. And Mark is right. I mean, 5 years probation, we said 5 years for a reason, and we thought it out. We spent the money. We deliberated. We fought, whatever, you know. So I think that if the other boards have adopted this model, and I know they have a lot more licensees than we do, but I would be in favor of it, in great favor of it, actually, because I think 1 year is way too soon. And some of these folks come before us after a year, and it's like, are you kidding me? And it seems like no time has gone by. Yeah. And for a lot of them, there hasn't been any change in their behavior or rehabilitation. So anyhow, I'm in favor, and I agree with Dr. Nunez.
This morning I was His Holiness, and now I'm President.
I'm sorry. His Holiness,
Okay.
President,
Dr. Nolan.
Doctor. Yes, take it away.
I am a fan of if it's not broken, don't fix it, obviously. But it does raise a concern to me if Candace is pushing back cases and if they're not being prioritized by how many years of probation they have, so they were on probation for 1 year, but we can't get to them. That to me is a problem. Does that make sense? Where if you've got candidates that are 5 to 7 years of probation and they're getting in the queue right along with everyone else, then that becomes an issue to me.
It is broken.
Dr. Sullivan.
Well, to look at the numbers, then maybe we should do more of our online cases and save the day for cases that we bring forward because they're contested or for the petition hearings. So I think that's better use of our time.
Dr. Waterhouse?
I like that idea. And I like option 1, but I would suggest making each case an option to us, whether we let them come back after 1 year or 2 years or 3 years, depending upon the case.
That might get you in a little bit of trouble if it's unless it's written down here, because then they're
right.
I think.
And we have the option of how much probation to give them. Why don't we have the option of how much?
Because this is in statute.
We'd also then have to review every case to decide which ones we were going to do that with.
Dr. Nolan?
I also feel like we are here, as Dick said, for a purpose, and so if it takes us more time, it takes us more time. I agree with that, and I would support the idea if there was a way we could do more remotely, that would be helpful too.
Ms. Poehler?
I'm sorry. I thought in the medical board information that it talked about those three, the gradation, at least 3 years, 2 years, 1 year. But it gave some discretion to the board. Somewhere.
Pharmacy board.
Yeah, so also the medical board.
I thought the medical board did
does.
too. So
Yeah, because
I'm trying to find the
number
language.
one, if I can be so bold, if the board would consider number one under option 1 should be amended so as to accept the board may order a shorter term upon a finding of good cause. So that would give the board some discretion.
Okay, good.
I do want to point out, I don't want to get into deliberations of this board in closed session, but as the board deliberates by electronic means when it votes, I would think that each individual's member's deliberation on a decision, whether to hold, whether to adopt, whatever, would be a fact-specific inquiry as to the circumstances and the findings presented in that proposed decision or stipulated settlement. I would resist strongly any understanding that we're just going to do more we're going to do more electronic voting for the purposes of reserving time at a board meeting. I think each individual decision of the board and the members needs to stand on its own merit and you would closely evaluate whether the board wanted to hold that decision for deliberation at the board meeting. I think that's sort of your fundamental obligation to both the licensees and the public.
And then if I could just say something, I agree with Mr. Hepler's opinion regarding option one. I actually think this is a nice workable option, especially in light of the fact that there are other boards similarly situated that utilize the same type of option. But the one thing that I want to say, and I'm not sure if there was possibly, it might have been an error, I'm not sure, but for option 1.1, where it has at least the 3 years reinstatement of a voluntary surrendered or revoked license, I'm wondering if that voluntarily surrendered what meant a suspended license. And the reason why I say that is because if you include voluntarily surrendered at the 3-year reinstatement, I think that would make it harder when we're trying to settle cases, because I don't really think many people would voluntarily surrender their license if they know that it's going to take 3 years for them to try to ask for their license back. In fact, oftentimes that's used as a means or sort of a negotiating tactic, an option. So I don't really, and maybe Kurt has a better recollection because he's handled stuff with more various boards. I just don't have it at my fingertips. But I think they're either maybe 1 or 2 year, but that's just a comment that I'm making, and maybe it just could be looked at in a little bit more detail, but something at least to consider, that might be if you keep it in there the way it is with the 3 year, that might be a disincentive for
So maybe just
licensees to accept it.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that point up, because on these 1, 2, and 3, 1 is just for, that's petition for reinstatement, and then 2 and 3 are petitions for reconsideration of probation. So there can be a delineation between 1 and then 2 and 3.
Right.
The question I had, I didn't think of that point you just made, Dan, and I think it's a very valid point. But the other question I had was voluntary surrender of license doesn't necessarily mean all the time that, sometimes people just don't respond, have like a default decision.
But that's not a voluntary
or there could be like another, I'm just saying that
A
just because
medical
they
issue.
voluntarily surrendered their license doesn't necessarily mean they committed an egregious act. That we just don't know.
And if you look at the pharmacy board's
when it was
language.
revoked, we definitely know that it was revoked for a reason. But I think that there's some, so I agree that I would have an issue with voluntarily being included in that for that reason as well. So we'll start with Ms. Bowler.
Right. I just wanted to go back to a question on the medical board. They have the 3 years with the reinstatement for license surrendered as one of the conditions, except that the board for a good cause. I wonder, does that hinder their negotiations, or has it so much? Or maybe the caveat is allowing the board for good cause to take into consideration people that voluntarily surrender for a personal reason, health reason, versus a sort of complaint reason.
Yeah, let me just address that. First of all, I think we need to draw a distinction. If I were a practicing veterinarian, which the good world should be glad that I'm not, and I hit all 6 in the lottery, and I mail that little license on the wall back to you, that's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is essentially surrendering in the face of discipline.
Right. Okay.
So that's
Right.
what this is
that's
geared
what
at.
it always is.
If you all of a sudden, you want to move to, I don't know, some enchanted island and you mail that thing on, this doesn't apply, because you're not surrendering in the face of discipline. You've decided to do something else, okay? So as Ms. Bowler is correct. So the medical board does have the thing of accepted finding of good cause shown. You can order a shorter period. And where that comes into play is pretty much the bargaining process, especially in a STIP. Because you would say, well, we'll include the finding good cause, you could come back in 2. Again, prosecution's not my thing, nor is investigation, but adjudication is, and as that bubbles up, that was a trend that I saw in the medical board. Well, the medical board goes one step further. They have the ALJ style, but this is only on the holding period, waiting period.
Yeah, I mean, my comments were more in line in keeping with the pharmacy board, because I'm more familiar with them and their practices, and they didn't include the voluntary surrender on theirs, and I'm just wondering if there was a specific reason for it, and if that reason was what I was referring to. I'm not sure.
Okay, Judy?
So we wouldn't have to go all 3 years. We could say 18 months, but something longer than just a year, or maybe it could be something that's in the, if it's a stipulation or a voluntary surrender, if they're, can be negotiated, and that maybe the minimum is 18 months, the default is 3 or something. I mean, at least we could play with it, but a year is too soon. It's just too soon. It's a waste of everybody's time.
Lee?
I just was going to add to Diane's comments that it's all, the dental board also, I think, only imposes the 3-year delay for revocation for unprofessional conduct. So they don't have the voluntary surrender. So, I mean, I guess what we're trying to get at here is sort of, we're obviously, if we're going to go this route, we want to rank the length of stay before they can come back by the reasons for the discipline. So can we be as specific as possible about what we think needs the longer wait versus the cases that don't?
Jennifer?
I'm probably not of the popular opinion, but I'm in favor of option 1 the way it is. I have some concerns with some of the cases that have come back after a year, and I'm concerned that lessening the penalties at a year undermines the severity of the penalty to begin with.
I agree. Here, here.
Dr. Sullivan?
But that's our choice. It's not automatic. We just had a petitioner a little while ago that we turned down completely. That's our job, is to decide whether to reduce it or not, and we don't have to.
But we have to go
But
through
you
the
have to
time
go
and
through the
process.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's
But that's a lot.
So you've taken all this time and energy to impose discipline for a reason.
Right.
And now within 12 months, the person's before you. The
They're
probation
reviewing it.
officer hasn't seen demonstrated compliance over a period of time to even be able to recommend rehabilitation. So this isn't a matter of just time constraints. And it's a little, I think we need to be careful when we talk about the reasons for doing this. The reasons for doing this isn't just you've got so many cases before you.
Right.
That's a factor you need to consider. The reasons for doing this is this enough time for an individual to show demonstrated rehabilitation? And if you're taking all the time up front to impose discipline, then why a year later, when we haven't had ample time to even assess if they're biological fluid testing, if they're under supervision, and we've only had 2 supervision reports?
Right.
To me, it's
Very
not.
valid.
It's in conflict with what you did when you made the decision.
And the fact that I have, or my observation is, I do not see cases coming 1 year out. They're
I
at
do.
least,
We've had a bunch.
They're
submitted.
and they're backlogged, and we haven't had a bunch.
Didn't we
Okay,
just
have a bunch?
let's not shout out out of turn, please. The other point I'd like to make in regards to the due process, I know that there have been some issues with concern that due process is not being followed. I really have a lot of faith in what the MDAC has done with the Complaint Audit Task Force. And also, Candace is going to give a report on the expert witness training. We definitely have addressed deficiencies that we've had with the way we evaluate cases. And at some point, we have to have faith in the system that we've addressed the concerns, and they're going to be given a fair process, and the result that comes out of those decisions is not arbitrary. There's a lot of work that goes into it, and if somebody has been given 3, 4, 5 years of probation or revocation, then there's really good cause for that.
Here, here.
Ms. Bowler?
Yeah, I was going to say, I totally agree, and particularly as a consumer, I'm surprised that the vet board had the year, and these other medical health boards had the staggered, which makes more logical sense when you're dealing with a very important, life and death situation. So that's where I was liking the option one because of that, especially when I saw the other boards.
Dr. Sullivan?
I move that we table this discussion until we have tomorrow's cases.
I don't think that's
Hearing no-
necessary at
Hearing no
all.
second, Dr. Waterhouse?
What I was going to say before that was, I'm fine with option one as it's written. If we add at the end of option, or part one, what Kurt just read from the medical board about, except that the board may at its discretion and for good cause demonstrate permit reapplication after not less than 1 year. Because that gives, I think we need the flexibility. Because, there's a whole variety of different cases that come in, and that gives us flexibility.
Okay, before we begin, we have a motion to table here. Is there a second?
No second.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what
Motion's going to die of its own accord.
So Cheryl, did you want to make a motion
Can I-
with what you just proposed, since Dick's motion didn't get a second?
Okay, I'll make a motion that we adopt option one, and under part one, we add that language that I just read. That, so it would read, at least 3 years for a reinstatement of a voluntarily surrendered or revoked license, except that the board may, in its discretion and for good cause demonstrated, permit reapplication after not less than 1 year has elapsed from the effective date of the denial.
I'd second.
Well, denial needs to be changed because it could have
Okay,
been.
then whatever
Just-
words and
yeah,
says you need to do.
Yeah.
So,
Can you tell me what page you're on? I'm sorry. That's not the right one.
It's at the bottom of the next.
Chair Nunez?
488-2221.
Yes.
Oh, right here.
May I ask a
You
question?
can just put decision in there because decision would go across.
did we have a second?
You did.
Second.
Okay,
May I-
so I'm going to ask for board input. The only question I have, is this going, who's going to make that decision then? Is that going to be just the same thing? Does the board need to hear that reconsideration? And if so, we haven't accomplished anything.
I think that there's a special circumstance that Candace could say, I don't know, maybe someone had a medical condition other than,
We're missing it.
You can't.
I don't know what it could be, but maybe she could kick it out. It would give her the purview to kick it out for us to see, and the other ones by default would go, no?
So we're getting confused here. You guys are seeing these proposed decisions. So when we negotiate stipulations, it will say in there 3 years, or unless for good cause the board adopts a shorter term for reconsideration. And then when the decision comes to you, you get to decide that. So if it's in a STIP, it'll be written in a STIP. If it's a PD, a proposed decision, it'll be written in a proposed decision that way. So when you folks sit and vote on a case, it'll say 3 years unless, and if you choose, we don't want this 3 years, then you write in your decision, we want this to be a year. You non-adopt it, or in your STIP, you say, no, we want less than 3 years. So you already do that when you decide on cases. You're not going to be seeing cases necessarily before the stipulation because we use this language. It's still going to be in a STIP. It'll just have this flexible language in case the board would like to see something different other than the 3 years.
So may I request, just to be really clear, because I think that's probably what we need, we would make the decision at the time that we first hear a case, whether or not it's a case that we would be willing to have come back in less than 3 years. So it's not that Candace would make that decision later on, or we'd have to reread something later and say, okay, we're okay with this coming back early. We'd make that decision at the time of first hearing. Okay. Thank you, that's very
So
helpful.
if that's not in there, they can't come back.
Right,
All right.
that's good.
Well, but this isn't restricted to stipulations.
No.
So I kind of see it differently. So let's presume for a moment that this is effective, okay? So then, in the stipulation, it's pretty clear. The parties would bargain, Ms. Rainey, Ms. Del Manayo, the Assistant Deputy Attorney General would put in a clause, hey, we're bargained for this, and you can come back in, let's say, 24 months, okay? Then the board, that stipulation would bubble up to the board, okay? And then the board could say, hey, we're all good with this, except we don't like you coming back early. We reject it. We reject the stip. The counteroffer, you're staying out for 3. Okay, so that's the stip methodology. As Kurt sees it, the PD proposed decision methodology is both parties are in front of an ALJ, the Deputy Attorney General, Respondents Council, more than likely, Respondents Council would say, Your Honor, we would request the good finding to come back early. Okay? That would be wrapped if the ALJ finds and our DAG does not object, that may make it into a decision. The board then would see, because this is a disciplinary decision, we're not in bank anymore, this is a pure disciplinary matter. And so the board would see that as it deliberates on the proposed decision. At that point in time, the board could say, we adopt, i.e. you're coming back early, or we non-adopt because we don't want you to come back early, and we as a board are going to stick the 36 months back in. So that's how I see it working if this were to be enacted into statute. So what that means is essentially then these people would come back, and then the board here sitting in bank would hear the sort of the relief decision, if you will. So we have the disciplinary decision. The board, if we don't choose option 2, as far as the relief decision I mean not modifying probation, terminating probation, or seeking reinstatement, that would not change. The only thing that would change if this were to be enacted would be the time interval between the disciplinary decision and the relief decision, if you follow what I'm saying. We're just going to sort of elongate that window from now it's 1 year, regardless of whatever is imposed, to possibly more than that. So that's how it works that's how I see it working in the real world.
Can you go ahead and do the default decision? You did the other 2 types of decisions. How would it work with a default?
It's a revocation.
Yeah. So if somebody were to default, let's be clear what default means. Default essentially has 2 meanings. Number 1, you weren't notified. You didn't. That's one. Or number 2 is default means I chose not to play. I took my ball and went home. You had a hearing. I could care less. I'm not coming. Those are default. So if they're default revocations, it would essentially fall under this because now we have a revocation decision. But again, a default mechanism has many fail-safes. Number 1, you can turn it around by saying, hey, I'd like a motion to vacate because I never got notice. I never was told of the hearing. For some reason, I never got the mail. Whatever the law provides in the case of surprise, excuse neglect, or mistake, or inadvertence, you can turn the default around. So there are some fail-safes to the default. I think this goes to proposal, like I said, the only thing, since the board seems to be most interested in option 1, not to repeat myself, but here we go. This option 1 just puts a time frame between the disciplinary decision and the relief decision, rather longer than a year.
Does someone second it?
So.
Okay.
And that's made during the stipulated settlements between the parties.
If a stip is the mechanism to resolve the case, yes.
And then if it's also made in a proposed decision, if it's done there.
Correct.
And then a default
I don't think there are any decisions that won't fall, any results that don't fall within these.
But once that is set, the board, with that extra sentence that we added, has the ability to say, you can come back in less time.
At the time
At the time the initial decision is made, the initial disciplinary decision is made, when it bubbles up to the board, if that's in a stip, they can say, okay, we like that, you're coming back shorter, or they can reject the stip and say you're coming back longer. If it's in a proposed decision, they get to do the same thing. It's a little more involved, because the adoption, obviously, of a proposed decision is no-brainer. The non-adoption of a proposed decision, I guess, is a brainer, because we order the transcripts and formulate our own decision.
So that one line really is only going to be technically done by this board.
Right, and
I don't ever see it being part of the negotiation process.
I was going to say, that's true. Not a lot of opposing counsel are aware enough or whatever. They don't bring that up. So usually that's not part of it. It might not ever be discussed, and then it might be just decided by the ALJ or not. But another way to look at this is just so that you feel comfortable, is that this issue is not going to come up based on the respondent's motion or request or whatever to modify or change. It's not going to happen at that later time, this shortened time period. It's going to happen at the beginning time when the original official decision is made. So you have control over the time period. It's not going to be pushed on you to make a later choice.
And just a quick question on what Kurt said about default decisions. If you do get a default decision for one of those two reasons, you either didn't get notice or you chose not to respond, doesn't that also mean that you actually, the accusations that are made against you are
deemed true?
Deemed true?
Yeah, and and just for clarity, just because it doesn't mean that you're not noticed. It means we have to prove that we sent the notice to the correct address of record, and for whatever reason they didn't respond to that notice. That's that kind of default. And the other default is when they did respond. We talked about a hearing, we set a hearing, and then they decided not to come to the hearing. So those are two ways where they don't come. In either case, the language of a default says that because of however you defaulted, the allegations contained in the charging document are deemed true. And that's the whole basis. And then you have to, and all those allegations, it's like it's a freebie. They're just true. Whatever we wrote in the accusation, in the statement of issues, whatever the charging document is just they can't now come up and argue about it because they didn't show up to the game.
So the burden, when you potentially petition for reinstatement, the burden is on you to address those accusations and how you corrected that deficiency.
They're deemed true. You just have to start out with, okay, everything here is true, but this is what I've done to help improve myself. Those really should never be an issue in those petitions for reinstatement or such. It's sort of about what have you done since then.
Okay.
Can I make a point with regard to voluntary surrenders? I suppose there's a circumstance where it could be, but in my experience, those don't come about through the hearing process. And I suppose if an individual during the hearing decided I don't want to continue this, I just want to voluntarily surrender, that could be. But those come about by stipulated settlement. So when there's a voluntary surrender, you all don't have the benefit of knowing that the matter went to a hearing and was adjudicated. By the same token, some of the things that I've seen, I have seen a case where there was a medical issue, and at that point in time, they were dealing with some very, very serious medical issues, and I thought, gosh, I don't know why they don't voluntarily surrender so that they can solely focus on what they need to focus on right now and then come back and petition in a year and kind of take care of it then. But if we're doing it on the flip side, you've got an individual who might have really egregious violations. The matter's set for a 5-day hearing. It's a little ways out. If they were to voluntarily surrender right now and come back and petition in a year, you again have not had any sort of adjudication on those issues, nor have you had an opportunity to observe them on probation. And theoretically, that could happen before the hearing would have happened.
But I just want to, I'm sorry to interrupt, just to, Ms. Rini, I think you would agree with me, though, if you set a hearing, the party is surrendering in the face of discipline, because we're
absolutely.
It's not a situation that I try to point out where you hit all 6 in the lottery.
No.
We have taken action to commence, we have initiated action against your license. If all of a sudden the 3rd day of the administrative trial or the run-up to the trial, a mandatory settlement conference, whatever, if you say, you can have this thing, I don't want to be that. We have commenced disciplinary proceedings. To me, that's surrendering in the face of discipline. This would apply in that case.
Absolutely.
So just really quickly, in that scenario where say I hit all 6 numbers and I win the Powerball, and I decide I'm just not going to renew my license anymore, and my license expires, and I buy a yacht and go away, and then my yacht hits an iceberg and sinks, and now I have to go back to work.
Well, you'd be dead.
all your money.
But my license has expired. If I want to get my license back, do I just pay a fee and get it back, or?
It depends on how long. Most boards, and I have to review your act, some have a situation that say, within 3 years, within 5 years, 5 years you catch up on your CE and you pay the necessary accrued fees and you're fine. Most acts have things past 5 years, it's like starting kind of afresh.
Okay.
So crash that yacht early.
Okay.
Chair Nunez, can I speak in support of the motion? I actually wanted to support Dr. Waterhouse's motion because I think it addresses our concern that we have that flexibility, as with the case, there was a motion in second, right?
Yep.
That we have that flexibility, as in the case that Candace described of the person with great illness that doesn't necessarily deserve to have to wait 3 years to come back.
There's no discipline.
But that we have the option to have that person come back early if we feel that the nature of the case makes sense, but we also don't have to do it. But that otherwise we're following the basic structure of option 1. So I'm speaking in support of the motion.
And I have a question for council. Would this language then have to be incorporated into our disciplinary guidelines?
I think it would. I think it would be advisable to put that in the disciplinary guidelines, which are adopted by regulation, because that would serve as notice to both petitioners, to both respondents' counsel and the ALJ and the board itself and staff of what the least elements of a proposed decision are, and certainly elements of a STIP.
So thankfully, those haven't been filed yet, so we could still add this language to our disciplinary guidelines. The only problem is this has to be, I think we'd have to adopt this by statute first, since we're restricted by the 1 year.
Yeah.
A couple of points, though, and then we need to go back to the motion, and I'll make it brief. When you have this in statute, it's your default, but in stipulations, you can do anything you want. It's a contractual agreement between the board and the respondent. So let's not forget when we talk about STIPs, it's a contractual agreement. We also have seen in PDs where the judge has, even though we have in statute 1 year, we've seen in a PD where the judge has ordered that they not come back before 1 year. It's unusual because our statute is the default statute that says 1 year, but the judge could order that as George could order it as part of the decision. I'd like to meet George. But when you have this in statute, it does give the ALJ in proposed decisions greater flexibility to use this language as part of the decision. They don't have to because it already is in statute. So to Diane's comment or Kurt's comment, I can't remember, someone said, well, Dr. Nunez said, we usually don't see this in our decisions because there's a default of a year. Right. So it relies on the statute. It's kind of this automated thing. This becomes statute, and you may or may not see it in a proposed decision. You should see it if you give the board discretion to lessen the time for revocations that are, or reinstatements based on revocation.
Any other questions or comments? Any questions or comments from members of the public? Call for the vote.
Okay. Dr. Nunez?
Yes.
Dr. Waterhouse?
Yes.
And I'm finding my page. Dr. Nolan?
Yes.
Dr. Sullivan?
No.
Jennifer Laredo?
Yes.
Kathy Bowler?
Yes.
Lee Heller?
Aye.
And Judy Mancuso?
Aye.
Motion carries.
Option 2, do we need to discuss that?
As I understand it, Mr. President, I think the board chose of the options, option 1, option 2, and option 3. I think it elected the options it wanted to go through.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, with the add-on.
With the word change.
Yes.
Okay.
So we're off to where now? Where's my?
10B, is that the one that's in the wrong tab?
B1 is okay, B2 is the wrong information.
Oh, excuse me. Oh,
Judy's tired.
oh goodness. Can we get coffee delivered?
Good luck.
Okay.
There might be an app for it.
So reciprocity issues license eligibility for applicants who are foreign trained or possess work experience in foreign territory. There's two things to discuss here. One is reciprocity for veterinarians, and the other is RVT graduates of non-AVMA accredited foreign RVT programs. So the first thing that I would say is that we are talking about veterinarians who are applying for reciprocity, which means they possess a license currently in another state or province of Canada or territory of the United States, which is Guam and Puerto Rico.
Puerto Rico.
And some other, yeah.
Yeah.
And currently it says that they have to immediately preceding filing an application for licensing in the state, they have to practice clinical veterinary medicine for a minimum of 2 years and complete a minimum of 2944 hours of clinical practice. The confusion came was, does that clinical practice need to be here domestically, or can that clinical practice be in a foreign land?
And who answers that?
If we go down the road of trying to allow that clinical practice in a foreign land, then we have to start to have discussions about, what kind of clinical setting is that? Is it equivalent to the clinical settings that we have here domestically? And that would be a very long discussion that we may not have to have. It's also important to remember that this is just for reciprocity, so it doesn't mean that there's not other ways to get a license in California. You can always take the state boards and get your license that way. Reciprocity is a huge pass. It means you don't have to take the state boards. So if we're going to give them that huge pass, I'm okay with making it pretty restrictive and pretty narrow on who we're going to allow to practice in the state. One idea to consider is, because there's two conditions that we have here in order for you to get that license. One is that you have a license someplace else, and two, you have this clinical training. The first part does specify you have a license in the United States or in Canada or in the territories. The second part doesn't say you need to have your clinical training there, but I would propose that we consider just adding that you have to have your clinical training in the United States, Canadian province, or U.S. territory. And that way it would make these two conditions consistent. You have to have not only your license, but your clinical training domestically. Jennifer.
I'm not a fan of the reciprocity just because it's an issue of equivalency. We had the same concerns with the alternate route program. If it were to be that they had their clinical training here in the States, I would be okay with it. But just straight reciprocity, I'm not comfortable with that.
So you're in support of what I just proposed? Yes. Okay.
Go ahead.
Members, Ethan talked to me, and to me this is, again, I don't do policy, I do legal things. So this is sort of in some way, it's kind of a legal question about how, as you read the statute and whenever you sort of construct a statute, you start off with you ascertain the effect act to effectuate the purpose. And so it seems logical as an attorney that probably the presumption is that you would get the clinical training within a state, a province, or a territory, because number one, you would want to fall under sort of the North American way, kind of the way we regulate veterinary medicine. Maybe in some foreign jurisdictions, I could call myself a veterinarian and practice veterinary medicine just because I could, because it's not prohibited. We don't, that's the first thing. And the second thing, I think, as you try to harmonize what's going on, I do believe that it would be the public policy, I think that Ms. Laredo and I think Ms. Heller is going to speak to, is that you would want that characterized in the jurisdiction. But as a big fan of avoiding ambiguity, it would be my advice, if that's the way that's the way this board chose to go, to make sure, rather than rely on my opinion, that we actually seek a legislative solution that would clarify that the practice in the 2945 hours be gained in one of those three jurisdictions mentioned in the front of the statute. So,
Dr. Sullivan? Dr. Sullivan?
Can we not go back and look at the original legislation and look at the intent of the legislation? Because I know when this was put in, I'm almost positive that was the intent.
Right. We did. It wasn't clear, but I agree with you, and that's been the policy. Most recently, we've had some challenges with applicants who have applied. So this didn't just come about because we thought it read funny. It came about because we've had some challenges recently. Applicants who were licensed in a state or territory of the United States but never practiced here, practiced in a foreign territory, and would like to apply under reciprocity. And the challenge was the applicants did not feel the language read clearly, that there was some ambiguity about where that practice occurred. So we were just clarifying the board's policy as communicated in statute.
Dr. Nolan?
I was going to just basically repeat what you said about the intent, but it's come to my mind, which may be a problem here, that we have a large number now of schools that are not within the U.S. territories or Canada that are accredited by the AVMA. So if you have a student that comes from an American town, goes to a veterinary school, let's say in London, takes all of their testing when they graduate, but is offered a position in the UK to practice, and then want to come back, that's a scenario where I think, it's a little bit of a fuzzy line, in my opinion. Well, I think they can, and I think they can go ahead and sit the state boards if that's what they want to do. But I think what we need to do is make sure that they're aware that even if they practice in an area very local to where they go to school, because of a job opportunity, they need to realize that that will be another hurdle they might have to face to take the, I'm just devil's advocate here.
Dr. Sullivan?
I worked for 2 years in Brazil, and I can tell you the clinical practice is not the same, and clinical experience would not be the same at all. So I think we need to clarify it and tighten it up.
Well, but Brazil does not have an AVMA accredited school in its locale either.
True.
I mean, with the intent being that we're going to have reciprocities with other states domestically, if you start to open up the question about, well, maybe England's okay and maybe Ireland's okay, you essentially have to go through every single country in the world and say this one's okay and this one's not, which would be very difficult.
And I'm not suggesting that. I'm just playing devil's advocate. I think that it's just important that if we are sending students to these other AVMA accredited schools, that they're aware of some of the challenges. So I would agree to support the idea that they should get clinical experience in the States. I'm okay with that. I just am trying to...
Perhaps they should take the test even if they're planning on staying in England. Take their test when they graduate.
Well, they do. They take usually they come from a state, let's say Kansas or New York, a lot of New York students. They take that test, but then they find someone or they marry and they want to go to another state. So they almost always take the state test where they're from.
They're fine if they're in another state. This is a foreign country.
Right.
So
but they don't. So
I'm confused.
I can tell you I can tell you a lot of scenarios when this does occur. They go to Australia and they go to an AVMA accredited school in Australia. Right. They're offered an internship, and then they stay for the internship, and then they offered another job and they stay there, and then their parents get sick, and they come home to where their parents are, but they've already been licensed, and they keep their license current in whatever state they were born in usually, but then they have another circumstance. So I'm not saying we shouldn't, I think the intent of the law originally was if you have clinical experience, it should be in the United States. But that was before we probably even had AVMA accredited schools across the world. So it's a wrinkle that maybe I shouldn't have brought up.
That's okay. No.
Before you go that, did someone have their hand up over here?
I have a somewhat different perspective on reciprocity because I come from another profession where it can be kind of difficult, which is law. And the hurdles and the obstacles that are put in front of people trying to have reciprocity with other jurisdictions. Now that we have AVMA schools elsewhere outside the currently defined territory, I think that Dr. Nolan is raising some pretty important points, and I think this restricts opportunities and imposes undue burdens on people.
I think Anne-Marie has the answer.
It's covered in the statute. Experience obtained while participating in an AVMA accredited institution's internship, residency, or specialty board training program shall be valid for meeting the minimum experience requirement. Kurt pointed it out.
But what if after you've graduated and you're working in one of those areas?
And I get what you're saying. They want to have the ability to keep that door open to practice later, but is that really our charge to allow them to have to keep that door open? If they want to keep that door open, I say when you graduate, you take the nationals, you take the boards, and you have your California license. You are going to have to renew that license in 4 years?
2 years.
2 years, and you have to have a certain minimum number of hours of practice. You just got to do it. If that means getting on a plane and flying back here and practicing for that minimum number of hours, you can keep that door open if you really want to.
I still have my Iowa license.
I have a question for Jennifer. Do you know, Dr. Druses went to school in Australia? Germany, that's where it was. Do you know what his path was? Because do you know what it was?
Yeah, he took the MICK.
ECEFG.
Yeah, that's right, yeah. But it's some international thing, but then he came here and practiced, right?
That's a pathway when you're a foreign graduate to come and practice in the States. You have to take the test or PAVE and jump through hurdles, and then you get your license.
So does that have anything to do with what we're talking about?
A person can do that if they want to pursue it in that way. This is reciprocity. This is so they don't have to jump through the hoops.
So this is different than that?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm trying to understand what the difference was on how he got here versus what we're talking about.
And when we go back to consumer protection, what we don't want to see is somebody who has clinical training in an area that is not equivalent to ours not be granted that reciprocity license. I like the students and young people as much as anyone else does, but keeping the door open for them, I don't think that really improves consumer protection that much.
So
Just
what
makes it more
are you
convenient for them.
proposing then, under those circumstances?
I propose that we clarify the statutes in making the two conditions similar. It says you have to hold a license domestically, and I'm saying domestically, United States, Canadian province, U.S. territory. So you have to have a license domestically, and you have to have the clinical hours domestically.
So if that's a motion, I'll second it.
It's not a very well worded motion, but it's my motion. And if the wordsmith doesn't object to it.
I'm going to vote no on the motion, so I don't really care.
And I think that's consistent with the intent of the original reciprocity. This reciprocity is pretty loose. I mean, it's a short time. Many states that have reciprocity is like 2 to 3 times residence or practice time in a state before they can move.
Okay. Any further questions from the board? Any input from the audience, from public? There's somebody new.
I'd definitely like to speak on this a little bit. I'm probably the reason why this got brought up on this agenda item. My name is Jonathan Chrysler. I'm a board-certified veterinary internist, and I've been graduated from Kansas State in 2003, and then went on to do internships and residencies. Practiced throughout the country in different states. Practiced for about 7 years in Florida, and then took on an opportunity in Hong Kong for the last 18 months to practice there and show China what specialty medicine is all about. And then my wife and I repatriated here to the U.S. Just this summer and submitted our applications to apply through reciprocity, and we were told that we don't have any legal recourse, no legal pathway to obtaining our license here. Keep in mind, I've trained more than 50 rotating interns throughout my career, which would be the people that are taking the NAVLE this year. And I was told that I had to sit the NAVLE again in order to proceed. And so I think that I guess what I'd like to have is a greater discussion of equivalency, and that any more than you guys are saying what goes on in Utah, you're not saying what goes on in Hong Kong or Brazil or what have you. And so I don't think that, again, is your charge, and I don't think that by allowing people to apply through reciprocity who have qualifications such as mine or any of my other colleagues that may not be quite as advanced as I am, who want to apply, can do so. Because I think it's an undue burden and undue hardship to try to go through this, the initial application pathway. And so I guess what I wanted to point out, you guys kind of already did, is that there's a disparity between the code and the application instructions. And so the code states that the applicant should hold a current license in another state, Canadian province, or U.S. territory, which I do, has practiced 2 of the last 3 years, which I have, and has completed a minimum of 2,944 hours of clinical practice in the last 3 years, which I have. However, when we get to the application instructions, inexplicably there's been some words added in to say that the verification must come from 2 years of full-time practice in the last 3 years, and it also says that that practice must be in one or more states, U.S. territories, or Canadian provinces. And so I don't think that the 2 documents are aligned. Intent or not, the 2 documents I don't think are aligned. And as far as intent, I guess I would just say again that there's a lot of good veterinarians around the world that do really good practice. And I think that that's the case. And they also don't need to work full-time to be good veterinarians. So. I guess in the end of this, what I'd probably like to see, number one, if you guys could discuss, number one, are these 2 things aligned, and is it the intent? Do the instructions reflect the code? Number 2, do they create unnecessary obstacles and undue hardship, making it far more difficult to obtain licensure for anyone who chooses to work part-time, as I stated, with or without disabilities? And potentially devastating economic effects on dual-career families like mine. My wife is a board-certified internist as well and is equally affected by this, who depend on that income to survive. And number 3, does it truly advocate for the consumer? You guys have brought that up many, many times already today. What is the evidence that meeting these requirements provides additional consumer protection? And then I guess for my own resource, just so I could check these things before coming in, is there a site that we could look at from the outside to see what the intent really was? Is there a description somewhere that we could look at and say, oh, okay, this is what they meant by this, regardless of what it actually says there? And then we'd have some more to actually discuss, a little more information when we come up to you.
Just to answer your last question, which is a really good one, how do you find out legislative intent? You look at the history of how a bill was moved through and what initial versions looked like, and there's a website that I think
leginfo.ca.gov.
there you go. That
But,
can often show you a bill's history. Sometimes the secondary materials might be from committee discussions, and that can be a little harder to dig up, but it's one way to find intent.
So is the problem that your hours were part-time and not full-time that you're disqualified from it, or what's the catch?
Foreign experience. So since my hours were not in the U.S., Canada, or U.S. territories, they don't apply.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation, which it was well presented, and this may be an instance in your individual case where, yeah, you probably would potentially not be a risk to a consumer or anything like that. But the reality is that you can also just take the California boards and practice. So you're not restricted to practice in the state, but in the situation that you've gotten yourself into, as the current law states, you can take the state boards and get your license and practice medicine. But for reasons that we've talked about, we feel that reciprocity is probably not a condition that you're going to be able to go through, because now we're talking about, okay, we'll give Hong Kong a pass, and that goes down that list of what we're going to give a pass and what we're not going to give a pass to. I mean, in your individual case, I know it's not good news, but that's the reasons why we've had these discussions here. But you still can practice. You just have to take the state boards.
I guess 2 points to that. Number one, I've been out for 10 years, so last time I took the NAVLE was greater than 5 years ago. And so I'd have to retake that as well, according to this thing. And then the other would be just, maybe a solution might be just to add, since this clearly does not come up very often, maybe just add discretion of the board to the rules, so that you guys, someone like me would come in and speak with you, or speak with Anne Marie or something, and have a good discussion and really kind of go through the merits of the application personally, and then decide from there. And certainly that would take a lot of time, but wouldn't be completely restrictive.
So I think moving forward, I think this is a little bit untenable, because we have a gentleman here who has an issue in play, and that is you're seeking a license from this board. We're kind of talking about the global issue we're going to see forward. So what I don't want in all due respect you, what I don't want the board to do is consider this individual circumstance here. We're kind of on the global thing of this legislative proposal. So what could be done, if the board wishes to address stuff like this on a case-by-case basis, looking forward in the legislation, we could strengthen or clarify 4848 with saying in special circumstances the board may evaluate this or weigh this or whatever. We can work through that. Okay, that would be something going forward to legislation. What I don't want to have happen, and I'm just a second, is that we consider this gentleman's individual. We can certainly consider his comments regarding vis-a-vis the legislative proposal, but not the individualized circumstance.
I have a question about what we're voting on.
Yeah.
So when we give probation, there's a MVBME and the NAVLE, right? There's like some mini test that we make people on probation take that tells us which one is that?
Species-specific test. Right?
Yeah, and so is that something that with this reciprocity that we could say, if you've had the hours, in these many years, you take one test versus the other? Well, how do you weight these tests against the amount of hours that might not justify taking the full-blown test if somebody's been working for a long time?
Do you want to answer that? I was going to make another point.
Well, let me answer Judy's question really quick.
Okay.
So the specialty area exam is very limited, and there's only two. One's large animal, one's small. But typically they're ordered based on a deficiency, and it's a very limited scope. So it's not equivalent to someone retaking an exam, that you're trying to make sure that they meet entry-level requirements for practicing in the country.
Right,
It's
okay.
a totally
It's
different.
not a mini version.
Right. The purpose for those exams is really someone has already
Some
demonstrated
deficiency in
incompetency
that.
or
Yes,
something.
okay, now I get it. All right, thank you for
You're
that
welcome.
clarification.
So I was going to bring up the point that maybe we could exempt veterinarians that are board certified in any specialty, because they have gone on to extra training. They're usually teaching.
That, okay, that might be an agenda
Sense.
item then,
Yes.
if we wanted to modify that other issue, that other point that Kurt brought up. I would like for us to just continue with the motion on the table.
Point of clarification, did Dr. Waterhouse make the motion?
I didn't make a motion.
Okay, who made the motion?
Discussion.
Okay, apologies.
I second it.
Okay, thank you. Just clarifying whether, because then he gets to continue.
Can we reread the motion,
Yeah.
please?
That was a long time ago. I
Oh,
know.
My badly worded motion.
So just sort of conceptually, the motion in front of the board has been seconded by Ms. Mancuso, is that we clarify the existing 48B1 to suggest, I'm sorry, not to suggest, but to make mandatory that the 2 years and 2944 hours be in Canadian province, United States state, or United States territory. That's the motion.
Is there any other input from the public?
I would like to know how to submit the info. I have a little letter and that sort of thing. How do I submit a letter to
Sure.
the
You
board?
have a letter to the board?
Mhm.
Okay. So you can submit it to the executive officer, and she can take it. So if you want to do that,
Okay.
that's fine. But I said, I don't mean this disrespectfully to your situation, it's just that you have an individualized situation, and we're considering a legislative proposal, so there's a little bit different. And so if in fact, you want to have a conversation with the executive officer who's sort of the day-to-day operations, my concern is that if this matter were to bubble up somehow to some sort of administrative proceeding or a legal proceeding, these folks would be sitting essentially a little bit contaminated by the information you give here vis-a-vis whatever comes next. So I don't mean that disrespectfully to you or your personalized situation. I'm the counsel for the board, and we have a situation where we have an individualized thing versus a legislative proposal. So that's the distinction that I'm drawing.
I guess then my other comment would be not even as my own personal experience, but working abroad, I've met some great veterinarians that, frankly, are better than some here in the States. And so when we talk about, segregating the two factions of veterinarians, whether you work in private practice or if you work in municipal practice like shelters, and giving them gradations, and then telling, Brazil or Hong Kong that, they have the same sort of, they're a different grade of veterinarian. As far as national, I can't even apply for California license unless I've passed the NAVLE at some point or gone through the MICKEY sort of thing. So, I think that sort of gives its equivalence right there. And then, so I think that to be inclusive of, a global community of veterinarians, I think we have to sort of reconsider what you're talking about.
Thank you.
Shall we call for the vote?
There's no more public comments.
There's more board comments.
I just want to clarify something. I did not say that the quality of veterinary medicine in Brazil was poor. What I said, and there are schools that I went to that were equivalent to any U.S. school. What I said was the clinical practice that I saw, especially on the large animal side, was not equivalent to clinical practice here.
Dr. Nunez?
Yes.
Dr. Waterhouse?
No.
Dr. Noland?
No.
Dr. Sullivan?
Yes.
Jennifer Laredo?
Yes.
Kathy Bowler?
I don't know, honestly.
Yep.
I'll say yes.
Lee Heller?
No.
Judy Mancuso?
Well, I seconded the motion, but now I'm having my second, now I'm having second guesses here because I'm thinking
Yes
we
or
are
no?
so global.
Yes or no?
All right, let's say no and then do something else.
Okay, so it doesn't pass.
So we'll do another motion.
So can I revert to the point that this gentleman raised? And again, I'm very aware that we're not talking about the specifics of his case, but about the conceptual concerns that he raised today.
We got to take it into consideration.
Right. Can we provide for a special circumstance application to the board to?
It's not agendized.
I would say this is not on
We'd
the
have to
agenda.
Then,
and we're not going to
then
talk
send
about
it back to wherever it needs to go.
We're still going back to the intent of what was written and clarifying that. That's what the vote is. If we want to deal with a separate issue, that has to be agendized, and I think we can solve it. But what is agendized right now
It's
is
clearing the intent.
what?
Clearing the intent.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to say.
All right, then I should have voted yes.
No, but in voting yes, Judy, you would have forestalled visiting the larger questions that were raised.
No.
So a motion
No,
was
I
made
don't
and
know. We
defeated.
could handle it in a separate motion.
Exactly.
So you want to call for another vote now that we
I'm not-
clarified, or no?
Before we do that, I'm a little bit perplexed about what the board is going to do in this individualized circumstance. What does the board think can do? Because generally speaking, in licensing cases, the power to deny a license rests with the executive officer, who then files a statement of issues, and then that bubbles up to an administrative law judge who's rendered a decision. But this is a little different circumstance, and I feel really hesitant to talk about it, but this is not a situation where we're going to deny the license. And please understand what I'm saying. We're not denying the license. What we're saying is this gentleman, on paper, does not qualify for a license. Okay? And so that's a different matter entirely. We're not, if similarly situated, if I were applying for a license and I had several convictions, or I cheated on the exam, or did something else, you would deny the license. I'm qualified, but it's against the general interest to issue the license. That's not the situation we have here. And so I want to be candid with the board. Does the board think that it's going to hear this matter with this gentleman sort of like we talked about, like a petition hearing? Because I'm not persuaded that the statutes allow for that. And Ms. Sokoloff can certainly chime in if she likes, but I'm not persuaded that that's permissible.
I would say, I'm sorry, I forgot what your name is, but he raised up some very good points that I do think we need to talk about. No fault of his own, he's very naive about the way the system works, and he can't just come before the board and expect for an exemption to be made in his particular individual circumstance. I think you raised some very good points that we do have to address, but this isn't the way that it's done. And I think that some board members have been influenced by his testimony to make what I consider is a bad decision on the very valid reason why we wanted for there to be consistency between the two aspects of reciprocity.
Yeah, you're right.
But I'm not saying, and I'm not closing the door, what you just said was absolutely wrong. If you vote for this, it's not completely closing the door to the issues that this gentleman raised. But we just can't just throw on an issue like this at a board meeting.
No, I understand that it's not agendized. I'm just saying that I had already decided to vote no before he spoke, as I think I told you. So I'm already have these issues in my mind as a policy issue. It has nothing to do with his specific case.
Why don't we do this, board members, if I can be so bold? Since we sort of had an unusual voting mechanism there, rather than tackle this issue again, I would respectfully suggest let's continue on conceptually, put this on the agenda for the next time, okay? Because in that way, perhaps we could flesh it out a bit. Right? That does not resolve this. That does not resolve this gentleman's problem. But I'm not persuaded that the board sitting in bank can do that. Okay? So what the board may want to do is reconsider this issue, and it may want to build in some, I'll say it, escape clauses, so that if it were to clarify that it only can happen in a Canadian province, or let's just say North America, so I don't have to repeat myself, then it could have some, upon a good, just like we did with the previous discussion, there may be a way that either we could carve out the discretion for the executive officer to make certain exemptions or something like that, or that if the gentleman was board certified and met some other qualifications, that would be sufficient. But what I'm suggesting is, I think as the chairman pointed out, we can't solve an individualized licensing problem right now, right here.
Can I ask a question?
Let me add to.
Okay,
really
go
quick.
ahead.
But I don't see this discussion and the memo as it was presented to the board solving anybody's individualized problem.
Correct.
The memo as it was presented to the board and the action before the board was to clarify the board's original policy intent with that statutory clause, because it is considered a bit ambiguous. So I'm not asking us to solve the world's problems, and the reason this was placed on the agenda is because we've had people come before the board. You're not the only person who has requested that we consider this. But for the purposes of Ethan and I being able to do our jobs every day, we need to make sure that we're carrying out the policy intent of the statute and of the board. And either it is or it isn't as we stand today. That doesn't mean that that's not what it's going to be in the future.
Right.
So I don't see this as us trying to solve an individual problem. I see that the gentleman before us presented a scenario that was a very real scenario, which is kind of was the impetus for us to bring this before the board. But what staff needs in order for us to carry on and do our job was the board's intent with the statute to align the experience with the education, training, and licensure requirements, that being within the United States or U.S. territory and Canada. Either it is or it isn't.
Dr. Sullivan.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe a person who voted against this could also ask for reconsideration for the meeting right now.
That is possible. But I don't, like I said, legally, I'm not sure of the value. I'm not sure of the value of reconsidering the decision, because if you reconsider it and we vote aye if this motion were to pass, that doesn't resolve this gentleman's problem. Maybe the board doesn't resolve his problem.
We can't today.
And so, all I'm suggesting is that since we had the motion, does the board want to revisit this issue?
Can I please, before my arm goes completely off my limb here? Okay, so I have a question about number of hours. So when you say clinical, Mark, when you were talking about the clinical hours, so the 2,000 or whatever have to be done. So if you get an AVMA degree, and I'll go back to Dr. Drusi's, he got his AVMA degree in Germany.
It wasn't AVMA at the time.
It was not AVMA. It was a veterinary degree in Germany. He gets some kind of international license. What can someone help me here to understand these?
You're confusing other pathways of getting a license with reciprocity. That pathway you're referring to has nothing to do with reciprocity.
Okay, so forget that and just go to reciprocity as we're discussing right now.
Reciprocity refers to the education that you've received.
So I took my exam where?
Where you got your education in a non-AVMA accredited program.
In a non-AVMA.
No reciprocity.
Can I chime in here?
She's asking what
Reciprocity?
You're talking about the
Yeah,
foreign.
you wanna go?
Yeah, I did mess that up. Reciprocity is, as it was written down in the memo, reciprocity is if you hold a valid license in the United States, Canada, or territories.
I got my license here in North America. Okay, now I leave
No.
and I'm practicing somewhere else in a different country
No.
and I come back.
It's all related
Why
to
is
those,
Dick saying no?
It's
See,
all related to those
we've
3
got to
years.
understand what we're voting
It's
for.
related to those 3 years prior to your application on coming back. Of those 3 years, 2 of those years, you have had to have practice, and you have to have completed a minimum of 29, 44 hours.
Here, back in the United States.
Well, that point
Church.
wasn't clear, but we made a proposal that it should be here. Because we had no idea of knowing
Where else,
what
what
level of
the
standards
situation is
the
going to be.
clinical.
And I get that, and that's
in Hong
why.
Kong, it probably was equivalent.
Well, who knows?
But we
Right.
can't say, we can't arbitrarily say except for Hong Kong.
I
Or
see.
except for London, or except for Ireland.
So
Well,
I think we
Ireland,
should, so I think I was wrong in changing my vote because I feel like we should get clarity with what we have on the table. And then if we look at his situation and others, maybe it's an alternative path, or maybe
Yes.
there's something else going on here in this more global world that we live in. But I don't think it should affect what we're doing right now. So I would do that reconsideration.
I agree that you voted wrong.
So
I did, but I got all nervous. I got nervous. I was making the wrong decision.
So just a point of parliamentary procedure. The motion to reconsider can only be made by a member who voted on the winning side. In this case, the winning side would be the side that did not wish to clarify. So everybody who voted, well, we actually had a split vote, didn't we?
Yeah. We had, yes,
So we had,
So does it go to the chair?
Help us at all, Kurt.
Let's try again.
Yeah. So,
Can I,
Yes.
so it's my understanding that we're talking about changing the code. I mean, you can't just throw words in here and move on, right? So the reason why I voted no is this whole thing needs to be looked at, and I don't believe that throwing in a few words is really addressing the core problem, so that's why I voted no. It's obvious we need to work on this, and let's not just try to patch it up, let's do it, and do it right.
But I don't think it's the same place that we're going to do it in, right? It can't be?
You're speaking out of turn.
All right, sorry.
Next.
One of the things I assumed if we had done this is that there might be a secondary consideration to just sort of review what other boards are doing on reciprocity given for future, given the global market and the various educational facilities and things like that, since we haven't even been presented with any of that.
That's a great idea.
But
We just
I don't
voted
even know
Yeah.
if it's germane anymore.
Lee?
And I'll be brief.
1 second.
And I'll be brief. The problem is if we vote on this today and then want to revisit it, we're asking for 2 code changes, basically. That's why I would say I'm going with Dr. Nolan and saying let's wait, because you're asking to go back to the legislature twice for the same area of law, to have them change it and then change it again, and they don't really love that.
so one of the things would you like, so we don't spend too much more time on this, what's the pleasure of the board? I think we have a split vote. I have a 4-4, so there was no prevailing side. The motion did not carry because we didn't have a sufficient number of affirmative votes. It sounds as if what the board may be interested in is, number one, revisiting this issue at a subsequent board meeting, with the understanding, I think Dr. Nolan pointed out, that perhaps there may be some need to do a bit more work here. And so that more work may be to clarify, but then provide some sort of, I don't want to say escape clause, but other mechanism to demonstrate sufficiency for consumer protection to engage reciprocity without taking the test. I think that's the issue, sir. Am I correct? You can't sit for the NAVLE because it's been quite a while.
My biggest problem, sure, there's a bit of a professional insult to have a board-certified internist sit the NAVLE again, but that's not the problem. The problem is that that's only offered twice a year, and there's no way for me to earn a living in California in between now and April when it's next offered.
Okay.
So that is a big issue to me. I could, my wife and I could sit down, we could hunker down and we could take that test. But between now and April, we have no way to make a living in California.
Thank you. So what's the pleasure of the board? Because we are sort of in an impasse here, I think.
Dr. Sullivan.
We have two separate issues, and I have no problem with addressing them independently. The first issue is clarity and intention of what is already here, and the second is a more broad discussion, a deeper discussion on how we can resolve a problem like this or similar to this. One I think is clear-cut, one I think is going to take time. But to say, we shouldn't do it because we don't want to take two proposals through regs or through the statute, I disagree with.
Well, I agree with Dick that it may not even be the same place in statute. Or will it be? Is it the exact same code we'd be changing?
Perhaps. I don't think we know that today. I think I'd like to comment on Dr. Sullivan's last statement. What staff needs is direction. We still have a job to do. We have to go back and consider these applicants. And I'm not asking you to consider this applicant. I'm asking you to consider the policy of this board as it relates to this statute. And I know we're on, this is getting a little fuzzy because the statute should be fairly sufficient on its own. There's been more than one concern raised about the interpretation of the statute. We brought this back to the board to say, make sure that we're interpreting the origin of this correctly. So regardless of what we do moving forward, staff has a job to do. We have to either make people eligible or ineligible based on the provisions that we're left with. So if you do nothing, we're left with these provisions, which is okay. This is what we've been operating on. And it has been applied that this statute, as it exists, does not allow for applicants under reciprocity who have practiced in a foreign territory and not practiced in the United States or Canada or U.S. territory within the past 3 years. That does not restrict this gentleman from being licensed. It just means he has to go through the traditional path. And I understand that's far more arduous than reciprocity is, but we're not saying this individual couldn't hold a license in the state of California. There's just exam requirements attached to that traditional process that are waived in reciprocity. So again, I understand that this is a much bigger issue than us checking a box today, and I don't mean to discredit the issue by saying check the box and move on. But you need to give Ethan and I some direction.
Chairman, may I respond?
No, I would say that I think that we did a disservice to the staff today because there is ambiguity in how it's written. And the staff needed direction from us to clarify that ambiguity. When we talk about the intention of when this was written, the intention was clear that the license and the training should be domestic. And that's how it has been assumed, but there's been some challenges to that. And because there's been some challenges, the staff has asked the board to clear that up. That doesn't mean we're closing the door on the issue, because as we found out today, there's other things that we need to consider. But by not voting on this or disapproving it, I think that we are doing a disservice, and I think you're confusing the matter as being closed if we clear this ambiguity up, because it's not closed. And now we don't even have the option to reconsider because it's 4-4.
Way to reconsider?
So we just need to.
I don't see why we can't reconsider.
Or
My impression was reconsideration.
You could take a vote to reconsider.
Or we could do a new motion.
I don't believe you can reconsider because I don't have a winning side.
But we could do a new
Another
motion. There's a new motion.
We can certainly do another motion, certainly. If that one have failed, is there a substitute motion that could be made?
I think I have one.
Okay.
I think I'd like to make a motion that clarifies the intent of the original language today, that it is what we said, the 3 years, the yada yada.
Well,
and
be a little bit more specific.
Well, what page do I have to read from?
24.
I'm not exactly sure. So the previous motion said basically that the clinical veterinary the clinic, the 24, 94, 44 hours in a 2
With-
years practice had to be in North
Within
America.
3 years immediately preceding filing an application for licensure in the state, has practiced clinical veterinary medicine, minimum of 2 years, 29, 44 hours, experience obtained, that we make that motion and just clarify current law with the intent of looking into this further. No,
We don't
don't
have
even, just stop. Okay,
The
go.
motion is
All right.
to provide clarity of where the clinical training is, to be consistent with where the license is.
Yes. That's my motion.
I second it.
Second.
Okay.
Okay.
Legal question. So, we all want to make the staff's job easier. We all want to try and address, the basic problems behind this law also.
Correct.
So, question is it better to address this as one issue and put it all back for consideration and deal it as one, or is it better to divide it into two?
I really can't answer that. I think from one perspective, there's an elegant simplicity of just saying it's in North America. Okay, there's an elegant simplicity there. Training's got to be done in North America. There seems to be some other thought that there should be North America, but then another way to get there, indicating that there'd be another, I don't want to call it an escape clause, but it's sort of an alternative path. So it really depends on what the board wants to do. If the board wants to say, we think it should be North America, but we allow for certain circumstances that perhaps are developed by regulation, could do that as well. That would address, got to be North America, but you have an out clause.
So, but what I'm getting at, is it better to go ahead and proceed with this and get this clarified in the short term and down the road,
Right, but
try and fix it?
Sure, but
Do it in two stages, or is it better to put it off and do it all in one stage?
I don't know exactly, because I think the question is, the board can't resolve this gentleman's problem, and I'm not quite sure that it can resolve, can't make a policy statement perhaps, because we don't really do policy statements. We either do it by reg or by statute, so I'm a little bit concerned, but in my opinion, it would be better to do it one shot and just cure whatever problem you think there is.
That's what I'm hearing.
Chair Nunez, can I?
Yes.
So, to clarify, we are not judges interpreting the law or its intent. We would be making a recommendation to the legislature about how they should fix what they didn't write properly. So we can tell staff that this is what we're recommending, and then they can go to the legislature and ask them to amend the statute. But staff just can't go back and do this, because you have to amend the statute.
Yeah.
So it doesn't fix staff's problem immediately anyway, because they can't just go start implementing it. They have to go back to the legislature and say, the board is now making the language of the two sync up, please pass this, and then we'll have clarity. So either way, there's no immediate fix on this, because it has to go back to the legislature and the law has to be changed.
I disagree. As an application process, we've been applying this statute for many, many years, and it has recently been raised as ambiguous. So regardless of what you do moving forward, we still process applications and make decisions on eligibility. And what the staff needed in terms of what was the intent of what was written here, and what did the board mean when it said, this is how you get through reciprocity, we have an obligation to continue to process applications and make decisions on eligibility. The decisions that have been made up to this point is that this applied to North America. There's 2 recent challenges that I'm aware of that says, hey, this is kind of written odd, and perhaps this experience requirement isn't about North America. So we have to bring this back for a discussion about how the statute has been applied. We can't put the statute on hold. It is there, and we have to continue to apply the statute.
I would encourage us to ask for Diane's input on this.
Okay, so I hate to, I'm not belaboring this. I just feel the need to come up here and maybe say something, because I kind of feel like maybe we're either we're getting far afield, or I'm not sure about what you're saying. So let me just ask a question, because my read of the statute said something that seemed relatively clear to me. I think the issue, and I think it's what this gentleman brought up initially, is that the language of the statute is not in keeping with the language of the reg. And the reg is, I think, that which is the restrictive aspect to this. So if you just followed this, and I could be wrong, so this is my thinking, but if you're just following the statute, and I'm not going to give a legal opinion here, but it seems to me that maybe if that were the only issue here, he might be able to apply, because it doesn't restrict his practice to the out of the country issue. I think that out of the country aspect, or the foreign, I don't remember the language, but I think the restrictive language comes in your reg. Now, Kurt, if I'm wrong, I'm wrong, but I think that's the issue. So you might need to just be looking at your regulation, because I think that's the aspect that is more restrictive. Or you intend to be more restrictive, which you're allowed to be in your regs. And I just think that that's where you need to try to figure out what you want to look into.
So I haven't really, I guess my concern as a lawyer here for the board is that there's a couple things. We have our substitute motion, and there was a substitute motion, so we have that in front of us. We also have an individualized case. I agree with Ms. Heller. This board cannot resolve this individualized case, and I'm not so sure it can tell the legislature what it intended. I have a little bit of a problem with that. I also have some concern, because really what's happening here is that I told the board that my legal opinion was that this all had to be North America. But out of an abundance of caution, I also instructed them, bring this to the board, solve it legislatively once and for all, because I've offered legal opinions before for various clients, and you know what? We were promptly sued. So I'm a little bit reluctant to go down that avenue again, because we have a statute in the government code that says no policy, manual, guideline, criterion, bulletin can be enforced unless it's adopted by the regulatory process. So that's why we are here, to solve this problem. So my continued advice to the staff, upon inquiry to Mr. Mathis and Ms. Del Manayo, is I believe, as your attorney, everything's in North America. Because it doesn't, as I read the statute, I try to harmonize. That's my opinion. It could be very well that a court of law says, Hepler, you are so wrong. See you next time.
Everything in the statute is in North America? When you say everything,
it's not even North America. It's another state, Canadian province, or U.S. territory. And some of our territories are not in North America.
That's the language you're talking about right now.
It's all in statute, Diane. It's not.
No, I know.
Right.
When he was saying the North America, I didn't know what that was from.
Right, but your comment was that the regs are more restrictive. It's all in statute. So this is all contained in statute, not regulation.
What I would say, I would like to just call for the vote. If it doesn't pass, then we're just going to move on to the next agenda item. I don't think we're accomplishing anything at this point.
I think that's true.
Dr. Nunez.
Call for the vote, please.
Dr. Nunez?
Yes.
Dr. Waterhouse?
Yes.
Dr. Noland?
Yes.
Dr. Sullivan?
Yes.
Jennifer Laredo?
Yes.
Kathy Buller?
Yes.
Lee Heller?
No.
And Judy Mancuso?
Aye.
Thank you. Motion carries.
Let's take a break.
Ask for a repeat of the motion.
The B word?
We're in a break. If whoever wants to know can come up here and we can tell it to you.
Yeah. Nancy, I'll help you. We're at a break now, so I can.
Is there subsequent motion? The whole.
In regards,
The delicious cupcakes.
Thank the legal staff.
the next issue is in regards to RVT graduates of non-AVMA accredited foreign RVT programs. One of the requirements needed for an RVT to be eligible to sit for the VTNE is to show satisfactory completion of an approved RVT program. The question has arisen is if there's a way for RVT applicants who have completed programs not AVMA accredited to satisfy those educational requirements. There is a memo in your package that talks about one possible answer to this question is by hiring associations or organizations such as the National Association of Credential Evaluation Services that can be used to determine the equivalency of these programs. If we did go down that pathway, and again, I would urge the board members to listen to me closely before you start going into crazy conversations. If we go down that pathway, that is going to be a very expensive pathway for us to pay for evaluation services to assess the equivalency of all these non-AVMA accredited RVT programs. Another possible solution to this is to approach it in a similar way that we approached the issues with veterinarians. Veterinarians also go through programs that are not accredited by the AVMA, and instead of going out and accrediting all those programs, what we decided to do was to create pathways, and that's the ECFVG and the RACE pathways, saying that if you've gotten your educational requirement this way, you have to go through this other pathway. And so I would suggest to the board that we approach this question in a similar manner, that if you have gotten your education in a non-AVMA foreign RVT program and you want to start the process of licensure here, then we should create a pathway similar to ECFVG and PAVE, and granted, that's not our job. That's something that they do on the national level. And so that would be my suggestion for the answer to this question. It's a national issue, not a state issue.
And that does not exist at this time, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Sure.
And then Dr. Nolan. So Ethan and I reached out to the American Association of Veterinary State Boards, and actually you'll hear later at the national conference this year, we discussed foreign educated RVTs and the pathway for licensure. So in your packet you see parts of an email that ask the AAVSB, what do you currently have in place for a foreign educated RVT to in fact come to the United States to make application for licensure. And their response to us is currently it's a local jurisdiction or state jurisdiction, whether they have, like we do, an alternate route program, OJT, on-the-job training, as deemed equivalent to licensure. The AAVSB is aware that this is not just a California, and I don't even want to call it an issue, but request. It's a request of other states as well that would like to consider foreign educated RVTs for the purposes of licensure in states that have licensure or registration for RVTs. So I believe that the groundwork is being laid today to create some sort of credentialing system for that foreign education. And I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Nunez, I think what Dr. Nunez's point is the board does not hold the qualifications to assess. We're not educational we're not an educational credentialing agency where we would have the expertise or the infrastructure, if you will, to go out and assess foreign institutions to deem them equivalent. That's why that's handled on a national level, because they do in fact have that infrastructure. So instead, should be communicating with the national body, that being the AAVSB who offers the VT&E, about creating some sort of credentialing system for RVTs that are, in fact, educated in other countries. And so the groundwork has been laid. We've been having those discussions. It was at the national conference. This is not the only state that's interested in this issue. But I think right now it's a little premature. We're in that kind of infancy stage where we don't know what that's going to look like. For California to take that on would mean we're taking on the role of being the clearinghouse for all things foreign education. And we just don't have the expertise for that. The ghost.
Oh,
jeez.
Okay. Can I ask a question?
Yes, Dr.
Are we talking specifically about foreign educated students? There are no non-AVMA accredited schools in the state.
There are non-AVMA accredited schools that are the alternate route schools in California.
Okay.
But
we're not talking about them.
Right, we're not talking about them. Yeah, these are foreign institutions, and there are no AVMA accredited RVT programs in other countries today. They do not accredit RVT programs in other countries.
Yes, Jennifer?
For once, I agree with you that we should approach it the same way we approached the last issue.
You agreed with me
Once.
That's
harsh. That is harsh.
I would entertain the possibility of the board appointing me as the world traveler to go to foreign programs.
Of course you would.
Evaluate
Of course
them,
you would.
But
North Korea.
North Korea, So the discussion that I'm hearing from the board is that this is something that probably should be pursued on a national level. And Anne-Marie has reported that the wheels are already in motion with the AAVSB for that. Any input from the public on this matter?
Nancy.
As I look at Nancy.
AKA Nancy.
I would just like to concur that CARVTA has been hearing from a number of RVTs that, particularly from England and Australia, that want to be able to work in the United States. And some of these people are very highly qualified. They're specialists. They're the kind of people that we need in California. And I would encourage you to do whatever is you're able to do to get the AAVSB to take this very seriously and expedite this so that we can get it. I mean, I realize that anything like this is going to take probably several years to get done. So the sooner they get working on it, the better.
Thank you.
So to that point, would a letter or anything like that?
We raised it at the national conference, and I believe we are going to stay in communication with Nancy Gritman because we would like to be informed of the other states' kind of motivation and what they're looking at. I think there's something we can do, which is encourage the AAVSB to maybe develop some sort of task force or subcommittee so that work continues on this, and perhaps a member of our board could serve on that subcommittee. And that's probably the most effective way to stay involved in the progress of this. So if that's possible, Jennifer, and we could communicate our desire to see that from the AAVSB, if you would be so inclined to help that process along.
Aye.
Ethan, can you make a note that we can communicate that to Nancy Gritman, that we'd like to encourage the AAVSB to formulate some sort of subcommittee or task force, and we'd be happy to provide a representative from the board.
So, members, I presume that's in lieu of seeking a formal legislative solution. That's
correct.
All right.
Breezing right through these
We
agenda
can
items.
get through an agenda item in a
Less than
reasonable amount of time.
30 minutes.
Board chair report, just really briefly, an update of activities of the board in between meetings. Anne-Marie and Ethan attended a board meeting for CARVTA in Sacramento and was well received. There's going to be there was a hospital inspection training in Sacramento, August 1st through 4th. Anne Marie and I and Kathy and Cheryl attended the AAVSB annual meeting in Scottsdale, and I'll have Anne Marie give a quick report on what was discussed at that meeting. October 4th was the Animal Rehabilitation Task Force, which I'll give an update in a moment. October 30th, I attended the CVMA Board of Governors meeting to give the board report, and November 3rd, there's going to be an expert witness training in San Diego. Diana and Candace will be doing that. The Animal Rehabilitation Task Force, fortunately for all of you, we don't have a final recommendation that we need to talk about at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Yeah, can you imagine?
Do you know when you'll have one? January or no?
There's going to be another task force meeting in January.
February.
In February, so it probably won't come back to us until April then.
Has the date been set for that task force meeting?
It has, but we've got a member, so we may need to adjust dates.
Okay.
But right now, right now it's tentatively set for February 2nd, but we may need to adjust a date.
So at our second task force meeting, just to show you, this is the agenda that we have.
Oh, come on.
All of this information that it's gotten really, ugh. There's been a lot of discussion about rehabilitation, and I'm just going to let you know what the motions that have been passed were. I'm not going to go into a lot of the discussion. At the first meeting, again, animal physical rehabilitation is defined as the treatment of injury or illness to address pain and improve function by means of physical corrective treatment. Animal physical rehabilitation does not include relaxation, recreation, or wellness modalities, including but not limited to massage, athletic training, or exercise. Changes to provisions are not an attempt to restrict or amend Section 2038 of the California Code of Regulations regarding the provisions of musculoskeletal manipulation modalities. Prior to performing or authorizing animal physical rehabilitation, a veterinarian shall establish a valid veterinary client-patient relationship as defined in Section 2032.1 or 2032.15 of the California Code of Regulations. In addition to that, we have now motioned and accepted that the task force identified 5 categories of professionals that may engage in the practice of animal physical rehabilitation: veterinarians, RVT, veterinary assistants, physical therapists, and physical therapy assistants. Task force recommends the following policy statements. Veterinarians have sufficient education and training to provide animal physical rehabilitation. Task force also recommended that RVTs may provide animal physical rehabilitation under the direct supervision of a veterinarian. RVTs performing animal physical rehabilitation must have additional training in animal physical rehabilitation to provide services under an indirect supervision. RVTs who do not have additional training in animal physical rehabilitation must work under the direct supervision of a veterinarian or within a ranch setting. Range setting. Ranch.
Ranch setting, that's new.
Do you want to define what a ranch is versus what a range is? RVTs are allowed to perform animal physical therapy under the direct supervision of a veterinarian unless in a range setting, in which case the supervising veterinarian may determine the level of supervision. veterinary assistants may provide animal physical rehabilitation under the direct supervision of a veterinarian or an RVT. So basically, the veterinary team, which is the veterinarian, the RVT, and the veterinary assistant, can perform animal physical rehabilitation, and there's been some recommendations as far as what level of supervision must be required for two of those categories. Yes,
Just to clarify, these were the votes of the task force to bring back to the board. They're not dispositive of the issue. So these are the recommendations of the task force, but doesn't mean that those are final. Because we get to decide.
So nobody's voting on them?
Well, we voted at the task force level, but the task force can only make recommendations back to this board. And then if there's a statutory solution, the legislature will decide.
Today, though.
No,
Okay.
because we're not done.
Yeah,
Got
so we're not voting on anything today.
All right, very good. Just informational. Thank
Yeah.
you.
this is just an update of where it's going.
Wonderful.
The next issue that's going to be discussed at the next meeting is in regards to what physical therapists and physical therapy assistants can do in regard to performing animal physical rehabilitation on animals, and what level of supervision and in what settings is that going to be allowed. There was also some discussion on outreach efforts, on informing the public about physical therapy, and also what needs to be discussed are regulatory issues as far as enforcement and oversight and so forth. Which board is going to be responsible for which person? All that and more at the next Animal Rehabilitation Task Force. Any questions from the board? Any questions or comments from the public? And so if Anne-Marie would like to give a
Brief AAVSB meeting. I included in your packet an outline so you can see what was discussed. Just really quick, I'm not going to go over these independent because you can all read them. Two main points I'd like to make is I was part of the Executive Directors Forum at the AAVSB, so all the executive directors, which are equivalent to executive officers, got together and discussed some of these issues. California specifically, you can see what I brought up, which was foreign veterinary technicians. So California did raise that issue. Animal physical rehabilitation was brought up by us, and I believe there was one more that was brought up by us. Oh, no, we engaged in the discussion regarding shelter medicine. Even though it wasn't raised by us, we definitely had a lot to contribute to that discussion, as well as drug compounding. So those are the three issues that I raised for executive directors to discuss. On the second day of the meeting, we went through several roundtable discussions, which is on the back page. We talked about drug enforcement, DEA requirements, unlicensed practice, drug compounding, and those were the three separate workshops that we rotated through. Really informative. California is leaps and bounds ahead of other states in terms of what we're doing with drug compounding and how we handle unlicensed practice. Some states do nothing because they have no authority to enforce. So it really is amazing. And then the other point I wanted to make was the telemedicine. I mentioned this earlier in the board discussion, was a very hot topic of the national conference. AVMA has done a lot of work. They produced a new, I believe, guidance document that is being considered. Is that correct? And
It's not finished yet.
okay.
It's almost finished, but it hasn't been approved by the board of directors.
By the board of directors, and that happens when?
Probably January.
So just for consideration, since we're going to be talking about future agenda items tomorrow, telemedicine, a lot has been discussed. There has been some new policy considerations, maybe something the board wants to address at a future board meeting. And that's all I have to say.
I would like to add that at the Executive Director Forum, California has the best executive officer in all the land.
Thank you.
And particularly her presentation on animal rehabilitation, her opening statement really captured the audience. That's all I would say.
You're not going to say the opening statement?
No.
Okay.
I just say that you really caught their attention.
Uh-oh.
Yes.
Under item C, we talked about veterinary technician name change to veterinary nurse. I mean, this is a big hot issue with NAFTA right now. And I'm just wondering if you have anything to say about what's
I do.
on there.
There was a gentleman at the conference that spent a lot of time talking about, and he's from NAFTA, this change to veterinary nurse. In some states, there isn't the title protection that there is in California. So especially, I believe in Minnesota, that's who brought this issue before the AAVSB, and they would like to see this become more of a common term throughout the country. However, in many states, the term nurse is title protected. Right, it is in California. So I don't know where that movement's going to go, but there was a push for states to consider some sort of uniform title that would apply to all technicians.
Microphone.
They're actually looking for Uniform Practice Acts as well, so I don't know how much we would support that.
Right.
Since we are way more progressive than a lot of other states, but
yeah.
The veterinary nurse idea is intriguing.
Yeah.
Because, when I first started working in it, 40 years ago, this discussion has been going on all along. And I did not want to be called a nurse because I felt that I wasn't a nurse.
Right.
My job description was, I was more of a lab technician and other things, I'm a hospital manager. But as the years went by and people asked me, what do you do? And I say, well, I'm a registered veterinary technician or an animal health technician, or I'm a registered veterinary technician. And they say, well, what's that? I said, well, it's kind of like a nurse for animals. And I realized that I was telling people I was a nurse. And so I've come around to think that, the public really does not know what a veterinary technician is. And they certainly would understand a lot better if we were called nurses. So in my opinion, I think it's something worth pursuing. And I'm not certain that the human nurses would object.
Mm-hmm. I think they've already talked to the RN board in California, and they did get some opposition. And it's not really the board; it's more of the
It's the nurses association.
It's the association.
The board just has to implement the law. They don't.
Right. To your comment though about uniform standards across the board, and then we probably need to jump off this topic, but. The problem is that there are a lot of states that don't license or registered RVTs, right. And so, again, California having the standards it does, you made the comment that's very valid, which is you may not want equivalency.
Right.
Yeah.
Can I ask one thing on here?
Sure.
J cosmetic surgery, were you in on that? What was that about?
So that actually did not get discussed at our ED meeting because I don't think even the states that brought it before the AAVSB really understood what they were asking, so it wasn't on the agenda.
Like ear cropping and that kind of thing, or what?
It wasn't ear cropping. There was some other push for, and I want to say it started with some sort of cosmetic dental procedure on animals, but don't quote me because it didn't get discussed.
I figured whatever it might be, it would be appalling to me. I was just wondering.
I just had one of my dogs have a vulvoplasty. Maybe that's what you're referring to.
Oh, God. That's it, yeah.
But we were calling it a vagina lift.
Okay, next agenda item, where are we?
I'm not sure if you told Candace, but I also want to let the board know at one of the dinners we were sitting next to the folks from Hawaii.
Yes.
And they informed us that they hadn't had a disciplinary action in
8 years.
8 years.
Wow.
And I asked them, well, how many cases do you get? About 5 a year.
Yeah, I've read about them.
And I said, well, what do you do when you get a disciplinary case? Oh, we drive out to the hospital and we talk to them and we just kind of make an agreement.
That you won't do that anymore.
That you won't do that anymore.
So that's the way things work in the islands.
Is there reciprocity with Hawaii? Can I go there?
Yeah, can we take them off the list?
I don't know. I've
heard terrible things about
I'll go do a
this
hospital
in
inspection there.
Yeah, I'll go with you.
Okay, any further questions in regards to the AVSB meeting or the Animal Rehabilitation Task Force meeting? All right then. We're moving on to item 13, the Registered Veterinary Technician Report.
Are they going to take us out? They haven't kicked us out thus far, so I think we should continue until we get through the agenda. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, I'll talk really fast then, so please stop
Just
me.
talk, yeah,
And a
talk
little
louder
louder.
into the microphone though, because I can't hear you. Sorry.
All right. So Ethan and Anne Marie attended the CARVTA conference in July. As requested, several issues were covered. The status of several pending regulations that pertain to RVT matters, enforcement of CCR Section 2064, the RVT exam fee structure, several other topics, the Veterinary Assistant Controlled Substance Program rollout, drug compounding and RVT supervision, the occupational analysis survey for the VTNE and the outreach efforts, and the VLE undergoing rewrite and efficacy analysis with OPES, California school RVT exam statistics pending in the board, the national exams, we discussed that today. And there were some issues raised by the CARVTA board. There were some concerns with one of the membership of one of the professional organizations on the board. And there were some inquiries as to the appointments and how much influence some of the associations may have on the appointment process. There was a concern about the fingerprinting process for the veterinary assistant controlled substance permit holders and the enforcement that all the individuals who have access and administer controlled substances would have a background check. And this issue that I don't think was broached before with RVTs being fingerprinted, is this going to be retroactive? The mandate was not before 2000, early 2000s, that RVTs had to be fingerprinted. So might want to decide if that's something that we want to go back and retroactively correct. Some other issues, it was questioned whether or not we have a representative on the Committee of Veterinary Technician Education and Activities. I believe we do not. Mm-mm. And as discussed today, which I think was handled in other issues, a possible new eligibility category for RVT licensure, so vet school graduates, maybe animal science major, bachelor degrees. So just several issues that we can discuss.
Okay.
Pretty much a Cliff's Note version. So.
Okay. Thank you, Jennifer. Questions?
Questions, comments?
That last point you mentioned about, the other educational avenues?
The eligibility categories?
Eligibility to sit for the
RVT exam, the VTNE
and what other programs are you referring to?
Well, the one we discussed earlier today, the vet school grads.
Are you referring to the foreign RVT programs?
No, the one we discussed earlier today with the veterinary graduates who have within 1 year to.
Oh, okay.
Just that one.
Can you read your couple bullet points before that one?
Which one?
About the alternate path. There was like 2 or 3 up. I looked at you and we shook our head yes. Which one was that?
Oh, the retroactive fingerprinting
yeah,
of RVTs.
Retroactive fingerprint. I think retroactive fingerprinting is good. Do we need to
I agree.
Okay, so do we need to do something with it?
Does that go to Kurt's point about if you put something in, it's not retroactive?
No, this is a different,
It's
different beast. Yeah.
Because I understand that the issue was that there's some licensees or some registrants that don't have live scan on file.
Mm-hmm.
Correct.
Right.
So as a condition.
I'm sorry.
So it's my understanding that there may be some part of the licensing population that does not have the live scan print on file, correct? And so what you're trying to do is recapture that by going with like a renewal, condition of renewal, you would say something like, and if you don't have a live scan print on file, go get one as a condition of renewal. Okay. That has to be handled by reg.
Is there an appropriate place to put it? That's coming up soon or something to throw in somewhere?
Under the future RVT agenda items, perhaps, is to discuss retroactive fingerprinting for RVTs. I wasn't aware that they weren't fingerprinted before 2000.
My memory serves me correct. That was addressed a number of years ago, and it was addressed through when they reapplied for a new a license, renewed. When they renewed a license, it was put in place that those before a certain period had to get fingerprinted. So I guess it wasn't followed up on that.
Well, I think retroactive is a little bit misleading because that implies you're going to go and actively get all the people who you don't have their fingerprints on. But we're going to eventually get them at the time of renewal. That's how the retroactivity will work.
So there is regs in place that authorize us to retroactively fingerprint RBTs and vets on renewal, just like council had said. A little thing called Breeze came along and interrupted the process because it's something that happens via ATS, which is our old database system. Now that our friends are using Breeze, it's something we can revisit.
Oh boy.
I apologize, I thought I was operating from the perspective we had a regulatory infirmity, but it sounds like we have a technical / administrative infirmity.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So,
yes.
Needs resuscitation.
Yeah.
We have.
So I'm not quite sure what the solution is. Is it just finally going to require it, or I'm not?
In short, you have to find out who doesn't have fingerprints on file.
Okay.
And match those records up, and then as you send the renewals out, you require the fingerprint upon condition of renewal. It's a little bit of a technical snafu to do all that stuff, but it's feasible, and it can be done.
We have music? Oh, wedding. So the board can direct us to start that process because we have the regs in place. We just need to do what we need to do, and it was probably directed by the board years and years ago.
Yeah, but it was before Breeze.
Before Breeze,
Yeah.
okay.
So do we need a note motion?
No, we just need to do it.
I don't respectfully, board. I don't think you need to. It would be folly. It would be difficult for anyone to countenance a motion to tell the staff what they should have been doing.
Yeah.
No motion. Respectfully, I would just suggest that the staff just
Get on it.
Do it.
Staff, get on it.
Wish it were that easy, honey.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Any other questions from the board for Jennifer?
Nope.
Any questions from the public?
Oh, wait, there was one more thing. You had that there was no member on something that sounded like we should have a member on. Did we take care of that one?
That's an AVMA committee, and I am the AVMA delegate. That's my job, to try to get people on that committee, and it's very difficult. It's a national committee that have very competitive situation on that committee, and there on some of the positions it does require that you have graduated from an accredited AVMA school, and not all of our RVTs have done that.
I think that's something that we should put on Facebook and, try to do through social media, seeing if anybody wants to apply.
We get people to run, but it's very competitive, and we haven't been able to get anyone elected.
So maybe you get a bigger pool of people and you get someone elected. Just a thought.
I think we need to point out to the AVMA that California supplies more candidates for the VTNE than any other jurisdiction outside of Canada. So
They know that.
They know that, but I think it should be said out loud because it seems...
They don't care.
Are they blocking us, Nancy?
Well, we're also newbies. We weren't using the VTNE until 2014.
Right.
I totally agree. We need people on that committee, and we're have a meeting coming up to recruit people for that. I'm just saying it's really difficult. We've got an RVT position open and an education position open, and we run people every year, and I'll try to do a better job.
Thank you.
So is it a good idea to try to recruit, to broaden the net and try to get people through
I think the channel
Facebook and
would be
whatnot?
through Dick, because we don't have the same connection to the AVMA. So even if, I think Dick said he's going to do the work in terms of getting someone on this.
Just even if you find someone, there's an election, it has to be promoted.
No, I get it. I just thought that if we
all the other
didn't.
states have to vote on it, and
I get
Takes the man
that.
on the
I
other
just
side to do
thought
that.
maybe to get more talent to throw their hat in, we would, do something bigger. If we weren't getting the right people recruited,
We're getting very competent people, but.
So that's not it?
No.
Okay.
Any other questions for Jennifer? Agenda item 14, public comments on items not on the agenda.
I think we skipped over something, and I just want to give it a fair shake here. 14A was the RVT exam validation and test plan discussion. And this is important that we highlight that we did send a letter, CARB sent a letter to the board. It's in your packet under 14A. Excuse me, is it 13?
13A.
13A. Okay, 13A. About the VT&E test plan, and asked some very specific questions about the content, the domain, some of the answers to the questions being legally invalid, none of the above, all of the above. We elevated this to the AAVSB. They responded in accord, and they also supplied us with the VT&E practice domains, along with, we included for your reading pleasure, the actual occupational analysis that was done, I believe, in 2012, that's in your packet. So it does respond to the questions that Nancy Ehrlich raised at the last board meeting. I wanted to make sure that we are on record that we have elevated these issues to the AAVSB, and you have information in your packet.
It might be a difficult question, but is this the study guide?
No.
That is being referred to?
No, this is the VT&E. The study guide that we were talking about earlier today was the California exam.
Okay.
So what is all this? What are we to learn from all this?
Well, essentially, if you read the letter, Nancy's letter, there was some concern about the content being heavily weighted on large animal and other areas of practice that weren't reflective of actual RVT practice in the state, and also that there were questions on the exam that had none of the above and all of the above, which are not psychometrically sound answers.
I remember now.
And so you can see the AAVSB's response in there. That
Yeah, I'm sorry, I remember now.
But
Thank you.
This is a list of the practice domains for the VT&E that was developed after the job analysis.
Correct.
There's also a similar job analysis that was done for the California.
Exactly.
And a similar list of practice domains that was created for the California.
Mhm.
Is that the study guide that's being referred to?
So the domains is something separate. The study guide or the test plan, the study guide is not ours, so let's not call it, that's carved as. We don't have that, and I don't know what's in the study guide. There is a test plan that's on the PSI website that covers, and it doesn't look exactly like a domain chart. A domain chart is part of the occupational analysis. It would be for the California exam for the VT&E.
But what I'm asking is that the study guide that CARFTA made is based on the practice domains, which we do approve.
The test plan.
So this is what we would approve.
No,
not
the
necessarily the study guide.
Right,
The CARFTA study, RBT study guide is based on the test plan for the California exam.
Yeah,
That's the
Right.
test plan for the
Yeah.
VT&E, the national exam.
I think we're saying the same thing. It's
Yeah.
just the terminology is different.
Not this, but the equivalent for the California test.
Correct. And unfortunately, the test plan was changed, and we were not informed. And so the test plan that's in the study guide does not match the test plan of the test, which I think explains the rather low score on the current exam, but we'll get to that.
Well, I guess that's what.
Are there any questions about the VT&E letter and response in the packet?
All right. Are there future RVT agenda items then that need to be added? I thought there was one.
Well, getting someone on the CVTEA, which we said Dr. Sullivan will work on, was the one agenda item that I heard. And then we have others from the work that we did today, that when we go over the agenda items for the board meeting, which is where on our future agenda items for the board meeting, we'll go over all the agenda items that were covered in today's meeting.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now
Item
may-
19.
Now, may I go on to agenda item 14?
Mhm.
Thank you. Comments from public on items not on the agenda? All right, we're done. We're done. We're recessing until 9 a.m. tomorrow?
Yep.
All right, if we left